They say an Alpha King can survive anything except the collapse of his own throne. Vaelor Draven built an empire on frost and blood, commanded armies that made nations kneel, stood undefeated in every war that mattered. But on the night of Dominion, while his court celebrated his reign, his queen and his blood brother drove a knife into the only thing he couldn't armor: trust. Now, stripped of crown and cast into winter rivers, the most dangerous man in Valtherus must do what no king has ever done: survive as nothing. This is the story of what breaks when power bleeds out, and what rises when a man has nothing left but the will to reclaim everything. Stick around till the end. You're going to want to see how this plays out. Drop a like and comment your city name below, so I know my tribe is watching. The grand hall of Moonspire Palace burned with light that felt like judgment. Chandeliers hung heavy with crystal, each flame reflected 1,000 times across silver-threaded banners that bore the sigil of House Draven, a wolf's head crowned in iron thorns. The scent of roasted venison and winter spices layered thick in the air, mixing with incense and the sharp metallic bite of too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Nobles from every corner of Valtherus crowded the hall, draped in fur and silk, their laughter rising in waves that felt more like performance than joy. Vaelor Draven stood on the dais above them all, watching. His presence commanded the room without effort. 6'4" of scarred muscle wrapped in black leather and steel-trimmed ceremonial armor, a wolf pelt draped across shoulders that carried the weight of a kingdom. His face was brutal architecture, sharp jaw, nose broken twice in battle, eyes the color of winter storms. Dark hair streaked with early silver, tied back with leather cord. 43 years carved into flesh that refused to soften. The Alpha King, undefeated in 17 campaigns, builder of the largest empire the Northern Territories had seen in 4 generations, a man who turned frost mountains into highways and blackwater coasts into fortresses. Tonight, he was supposed to celebrate. The Night of Dominion marked 12 years since his coronation, 12 years since he unified the warring clans under one banner and dragged Valtherus out of endless bloodshed into something resembling order. The nobles below him raised goblets of dark wine, toasting his name with enthusiasm that ranged from genuine to calculated. Vaelor barely heard them, his gaze fixed on the woman beside him. Queen Cerys Vael stood with the kind of beauty that weaponized itself. Auburn hair cascading in perfect waves, emerald dress cut to enhance every curve, a smile that could disarm generals and charm merchants into bankruptcy. She moved through court politics like water through cracks in stone, effortless, invasive, inevitable. The jewel of the throne, they called her, the perfect Luna to his Alpha. She laughed at something Lord Brennan said, her hand resting on the throne's arm with casual ownership. Vaelor studied her profile. He'd known Cerys for 14 years, married her for 11. She came from the Vale territories, a strategic union that brought eastern shipping routes under crown control. Smart match, clean alliance. She performed her role flawlessly, gracious in public, sharp in council meetings, passionate in private when passion served a purpose. But something in her eyes tonight felt wrong. A distance. A performance inside the performance. Vaelor's instincts had kept him alive through 2 assassination attempts, 3 major rebellions, and more battlefield ambushes than he cared to count. Those instincts whispered warnings he couldn't yet name. Lord Cassian Thorne approached the dais, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who belonged everywhere. Vaelor's general, his sword brother for 20 years, the man who stood beside him in the Battle of Frostbreak Ridge, when 500 warriors held against 3,000. The man who pulled an enemy blade from Vaelor's back during the siege of Thornhaven and carried him 6 miles through hostile territory. Cassian was everything a general should be: tactical genius, fearless in combat, loyal to the bone, or so Vaelor believed. Cassian reached the dais and clasped Vaelor's forearm in the warrior's greeting, his grip iron strong. Blonde hair pulled back military tight, blue eyes sharp as winter ice, a scar running from left temple to jaw, souvenir from a battle they'd won together. "Your empire stands because you made hard choices when soft men would have crumbled," Cassian said. His voice carried the gravel of too many war camps, too many knights shouting orders over steel and screaming, to 12 more years of hard choices. The nobles roared approval. Vaelor returned the grip, searching Cassian's face for something he couldn't articulate. They'd shared blood and brotherhood. They'd built this empire together, one brutal decision at a time. Yet tonight Cassian's smile felt rehearsed. Cerys touched Vaelor's arm, her fingers cool against his skin. "You should address them," she murmured. "They came to hear their king speak." Vaelor turned to the assembly. The hall quieted instantly. When an Alpha King moved, attention followed like gravity. He didn't prepare speeches. Words served function, not decoration. "Valtheris exists because warriors chose duty over comfort," he said. His voice filled the hall without strain, decades of command conditioning every syllable. Because farmers chose harvest over hunger. Because builders chose stone over shelter. This empire wasn't given, it was earned. Every day, it must be earned again. The nobles murmured appreciation. "Tonight we celebrate survival," Vaelor continued. "But survival means nothing without purpose. This kingdom stands because we understand a truth weak nations forget. Strength isn't cruelty. Strength is the discipline to protect what matters when protecting it costs everything." He paused, scanning faces. "So drink your wine. Enjoy the feast. Tomorrow, we return to the work of making this empire worthy of the blood that built it." The hall erupted in applause and raised goblets. Vaelor sat, the weight of the throne pressing into his spine. Cerys leaned close, her breath warm against his ear. "Perfectly spoken, my king. Though sometimes I wonder if you inspire loyalty or simply intimidate men into obedience." There was something in her tone, an edge wrapped in silk. "Loyalty and fear aren't opposites," Vaelor said. "Both serve their purpose." "Do they?" Cerys smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps that's why you've never understood the difference." She rose smoothly, her dress whispering across stone. "I should mingle with the Lord's wives. They expect the queen to grace them with attention." She descended the dais, moving into the crowd with practiced charm. Vaelor watched her go, that whisper of wrongness growing louder. Cassian appeared at his shoulder. "She's right, you know. You should walk among them. Let them see their king as a man, not just a monument." Vaelor glanced at his general. "You think I'm too distant?" "I think you're too honest," Cassian said. "You tell them survival requires sacrifice. They want you to tell them sacrifice is optional. Then they're fools. Most men are." Cassian's expression shifted, something unreadable moving beneath the surface. "That's why they need kings who'll make the hard choices for them." He gripped Vaelor's shoulder briefly, then followed Cerys into the crowd. Vaelor remained on the dais, alone in a room filled with hundreds. The celebration continued. Musicians played. Nobles danced. Servants refilled wine goblets with mechanical efficiency. And somewhere beneath the performance, rot festered. 2 hours later, the wine ran heavy and the dancing grew sloppy. Vaelor descended from the dais, moving through the crowd. He didn't enjoy these events, too much pretense, too many smiles hiding calculations, but presence mattered. A king who remained above his people risked becoming irrelevant to them. Lord Brennan intercepted him near the western columns, breath thick with alcohol. "Your Majesty, tremendous speech, truly tremendous. My son serves in the 4th Legion, you know. Writes home about how your reforms improved rations and equipment. The men worship you." Vaelor nodded. "The 4th distinguished themselves at Ravenwood." "Your son should be proud." "He is. We all are." Brennan swayed slightly. "To serve under the Alpha King, what greater honor exists?" Vaelor extricated himself politely and continued through the hall. He passed Lady Morwen, who bowed with exaggerated grace, and Lord Theron, who wanted to discuss trade tariffs. He endured 3 more conversations about military glory and economic prosperity before the crowd's pressure became suffocating. He needed air. Vaelor slipped through a servant's entrance, leaving the celebration behind. The palace corridors stretched long and empty, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across stone walls. The temperature dropped immediately. Moonspire Palace was ancient, built into the mountain itself, its foundations carved from living rock. Beautiful, but cold. Impressive, but isolating. Like the throne itself. Vaelor walked without destination, letting his boots echo through empty halls. He'd built this empire through discipline and violence. He'd made choices that haunted him, executing rebels, burning villages that harbored traitors, sacrificing soldiers in battles that demanded blood for victory. Every king ruled through compromise with brutality. The question was whether the brutality served justice or simply power. Vaelor believed he'd chosen justice. But lately, doubt crept in. He'd sacrificed so much for the crown, relationships, peace, any chance at a life beyond duty. And for what? An empire that felt more like obligation than achievement, a marriage that functioned but didn't sustain, alliances built on fear disguised as respect. He'd won everything, and somehow, it felt like nothing. Vaelor turned a corner into the palace's eastern wing, where guest chambers and private offices lined marble corridors. That's when he heard voices, low, urgent, coming from behind a door slightly ajar. He recognized those voices. Vaelor moved silently, decades of combat training making each step soundless. He approached the door, staying in shadow. Through the gap, he saw them. Cerys and Cassian, standing close, too close. Cerys' hand rested on Cassian's chest. Cassian's fingers traced her jaw with a familiarity that spoke of repetition, of practice, of intimacy that predated tonight. "This can't continue," Cassian said. His voice carried strain. "He suspects. I saw it in how he watched us." Cerys laughed softly. "Vaelor suspects nothing. He sees duty and crowns and empire. He doesn't see people. He never has. You don't know him like I do." "I know him better than you think." Cerys' voice hardened. "I've spent 11 years beside a man who treats marriage like a military alliance, who touches me with the same emotion he'd show inspecting a fortress wall. Do you know what that does to a woman? To be owned but never wanted?" Cassian's jaw tightened. "We agreed we'd wait. After the reforms pass, after the northern lords settle, after never comes." Cerys stepped back, her emerald dress catching lamplight. "I'm done waiting. We've wasted years pretending this arrangement serves anyone." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the throne requires an alpha king." She met his eyes. "But it doesn't require this alpha king." The words hung in the air like poison. Cassian's expression shifted. Surprise, then understanding, then something darker. "You can't be serious. Watch me. If we move against him, there's no going back. He's not some rival lord we can outmaneuver. He's Vaelor Draven, undefeated, untouchable." "Everyone's touchable," Cerys said coldly. "They just require the right touch." Outside the door, Vaelor stood perfectly still, his body locked into combat stillness, the kind that preceded violence. But his mind raced, processing information that rewrote 14 years of history. How long? That was the question burning through him. How long had this betrayal breathed behind his back? Months? Years? Had their entire relationship been performance? Had Cassian's brotherhood been calculated manipulation? And worse, how many others knew? How many courtiers watched him with hidden smiles, aware that his queen warmed another man's bed and his general plotted behind his crown? The humiliation cut deeper than the betrayal. An alpha king could survive enemies. Enemies proved strength mattered. But to be cuckolded in his own palace by his own wife and his own blood brother while his entire court watched and whispered, that didn't wound the man, that wounded the kingdom itself. Vaelor's hand moved toward the sword at his hip. Muscle memory. Trained response. 20 years of solving problems with steel. He could kill them both right now. Kick open the door, draw blade, end this before another word poisoned the air. But something stopped him. Not mercy. Not hesitation. Strategy. If he killed them now, he'd prove Cerys right, that he saw only violence, only immediate solutions, only the hammer when situations required scalpels. And more dangerous, he didn't know how deep this went. Who else conspired? How many guards had been bribed? Which lords waited to support a coup? Acting on rage meant acting blind. And Vaelor Draven didn't act blind. He stepped back from the door, silent as death, and returned to the shadows. The celebration continued another 3 hours. Vaelor returned to the grand hall, his face carved from stone, his movements mechanical. He stood. He nodded. He accepted toasts and praise while something ancient fractured inside his chest. Cerys rejoined him eventually, her smile perfect, her performance flawless. "Did you enjoy your walk?" she asked sweetly. "Necessary escape," Vaelor said. "The crowd grows tiresome." She touched his arm. "Perhaps we should retire soon. These events exhaust me. He looked at her, really looked, searching for any crack in the facade, any hint of the woman who'd just discussed his removal like debating furniture arrangements. Nothing. She was perfect. And that perfection was the most damning evidence of all. Soon, Vaelor agreed. Cassian found him an hour later, suggesting they review morning troop deployments. His face showed nothing, no guilt, no concern, just the professional focus of a general doing his duty. Vaelor discussed strategy with the man planning his murder, and his voice never wavered, because an Alpha King learned early. Survival required swallowing fury until fury could be weaponized. Finally, near midnight, the celebration ended. Nobles departed in swaying, laughing groups. Servants cleared tables. Musicians packed instruments. Vaelor climbed the stairs to the royal chambers, Cerys beside him. They entered their private suite, massive space overlooking the capital, walls covered in tapestries depicting military victories, fireplace large enough to roast a wolf. Cerys moved to her dressing chamber. "I'll prepare for bed." Vaelor stood at the window, staring at the city below. Moonlight painted Valtheris in silver and shadow, thousands of buildings spreading across the valley like offerings to the mountain. He'd built this, every street, every wall, every bridge, born from his will and watered with blood. And now the two people he'd trusted most wanted to take it from him. The bedroom door closed. Vaelor remained at the window, his reflection staring back, a king who'd won every battle except the one that mattered most. He didn't sleep that night, and he didn't confront them, not yet, because Vaelor understood something that softer men never learned. Sometimes survival meant swallowing poison until you could identify everyone serving it. He would watch, he would wait, and when he moved, there would be no mercy, no second chances, only the kind of reckoning that reminded empires why they feared their kings. But 3 days passed. Vaelor maintained perfect composure. He attended council meetings, reviewed border reports, settled disputes between merchant guilds. He ate meals beside Cerys, discussed strategy with Cassian, performed every duty exactly as expected, while he watched, while he catalogued, which guards avoided eye contact, which servants whispered when he entered rooms, which nobles suddenly found urgent business elsewhere when he approached. The conspiracy wasn't subtle once you knew to look for it. Lord Farron, master of the royal treasury, had been distant lately. Captain Reese of the palace guard requested unusual shift changes. Even the court physician seemed nervous during routine examinations. The rot ran deeper than two traitors. It was systemic. On the fourth night, Cassian invited him to review fortification plans in the lower strategy room. Vaelor agreed. They descended through palace levels carved from mountain stone, passing through guard checkpoints staffed by men whose loyalty Vaelor now questioned. The strategy room sat deep in the palace foundation, surrounded by rock and accessible through a single entrance. Secure, private, perfect for sensitive military discussions, or perfect for assassination. Cassian spread maps across the stone table, positioning oil lamps for better light. "The northern border requires reinforcement," he said. "Raiders from the Frost Wastes grow bolder. I recommend moving the 2nd Legion to—" "How long?" Vaelor interrupted. Cassian looked up. "What? How long have you been planning this?" Silence filled the chamber like water filling a drowning man's lungs. Cassian's hand moved subtly toward his weapon, then stopped. He straightened slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to cold calculation. "I don't know what you think you—" "Don't," Vaelor said quietly. "Don't insult both of us with lies." They faced each other across the table, two warriors who'd shared battlefields and brotherhood, now separated by a betrayal that couldn't be bridged. Cassian's jaw worked. Then he laughed, sharp, bitter sound. "You know then. When did you figure it out?" "The night of Dominion. I heard enough." "And you said nothing." Cassian shook his head slowly. "That's so perfectly you, Vaelor. Always watching, always calculating, never actually feeling anything." "I feel plenty," Vaelor said. His voice remained level, but something dangerous moved beneath it. "I just don't let feeling dictate action." "That's the problem." Cassian stepped back from the table. "You're so busy being the perfect king, you forgot how to be human. Cerys isn't wrong about you. You treat people like chess pieces. Your queen, your general, your entire empire, just resources to deploy. I treated you like a brother. Did you? Cassian's expression hardened. Or did you treat me like a useful weapon? How many times did you send me into battles you wouldn't fight yourself? How many soldiers died following my orders while you stayed safe in your strategy rooms? Leadership isn't about personal glory, Vaelor said. It's about, don't lecture me about leadership. Cassian slammed his palm on the table. I've bled for this empire. I've earned my place here. But no matter what I achieve, I'm always your second, your shadow, the sword that fights while you take credit for the victories. You want credit? Vaelor's voice dropped colder. Is that what this is? You're fucking my wife and plotting my murder because you feel underappreciated? I want what I've earned, Cassian said. What we've earned. Cerys and I built this empire as much as you did. We deserve more than being your accessories. You deserve a throne soaked in my blood, if that's what it takes. The admission hung between them, naked and unforgivable. Vaelor studied the man he'd called brother, searching for any trace of the warrior who'd saved his life at Thornhaven, who'd stood beside him through years of brutal campaigns. Gone. Or perhaps never there. Perhaps Cassian had always been this, ambition wrapped in loyalty's clothing, waiting for the moment to strike. The guards outside are mine, Cassian said. The wine you'll drink tonight is poisoned. The servants who prepare your chambers have been paid. You won't survive the night. Vaelor nodded slowly. Efficient. Clean. Very like you. It's nothing personal. Cassian's voice held something almost apologetic. You're a great king, truly. But great kings make terrible people, and eventually even empires need to evolve past the men who built them. Wrong, Vaelor said quietly. About what? Everything. He held Cassian's gaze. You think you've planned this perfectly. You think you've accounted for every variable. But you forgot the most important lesson I ever taught you. What's that? Survivors don't announce their plans. Vaelor moved. 20 years of combat experience compressed into explosive action. He seized the oil lamp from the table and hurled it at Cassian's face. The glass shattered. Oil sprayed. Flame caught. Cassian stumbled back, arms raised against sudden fire. Vaelor drew his blade and charged, but Cassian was ready, had always been ready. He rolled beneath the strike and drew his own sword, and suddenly the strategy room became battlefield. Steel rang against stone. Sparks flew in darkness, barely held back by scattered flames. They fought with the brutal efficiency of warriors who'd trained together, who knew each other's moves, who understood exactly how the other thought. No theatrics, no grand speeches, just violence distilled to its purest form. Cassian drove forward with a combination that would have gutted lesser men. Vaelor deflected and countered with a throat strike that missed by inches. They circled through scattered maps and burning oil, neither gaining advantage. You can't win, Cassian panted. Even if you kill me, the plan continues. Cerys holds the council. The guards are loyal to gold, not crowns. Then I'll kill them all, Vaelor snarled. They clashed again, blades screaming. But Cassian hadn't lied. The door burst open, palace guards flooded in, 6 men, weapons drawn, faces set with mercenary determination. Vaelor killed 2 before they crossed the threshold. His blade opened throats and split skulls with mechanical precision. But numbers mattered. They swarmed him, forcing him back, separating him from Cassian. A sword opened his shoulder, another caught his ribs. Pain bloomed hot and immediate. Vaelor fought like a cornered wolf, all savage desperation and refusing mortality. He took another guard down, then another. But steel accumulated. His leg buckled. Blood poured from wounds in shoulder, ribs, thigh. His vision tunneled. The remaining guards pressed in for the kill. Then the eastern wall exploded. Rock shattered inward as something massive struck from outside. Dust filled the air. Screaming erupted. Not from Vaelor, but from guards suddenly facing new threat. Through the dust and chaos, Vaelor glimpsed shapes. Large, feral, moving with predatory intelligence. Wolves. The palace guard wolf pack. Creatures trained for war, bonded to Vaelor since they were cubs. Somehow, they'd sensed their alpha's danger and broken through stone itself to reach him. The guards didn't stand a chance. Wolves tore through them with brutal efficiency while Vaelor slumped against the wall, bleeding from multiple wounds. Cassian stood frozen, his face pale with shock. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't... Go, Vaelor said. His voice came weak, each word costing him. "Tell Ceres she won. Tell her the king is dead." Cassian hesitated, torn between finishing what he started and escaping with his life. Self-preservation won. He ran. The wolves didn't follow. They surrounded Vaelor instead, whining, licking his wounds with futile care. Vaelor leaned his head back against cold stone. Blood pooled beneath him. The wounds were deep, fatal, probably. Fitting, he thought with bitter clarity. The Alpha King, brought down not by worthy enemies, but by the people he'd trusted most. Not in battle, in shadow, like he'd never mattered at all. More guards approached. He could hear boots echoing through corridors. Cassian rallying forces, coming to finish what they'd started. Vaelor had two choices. Stay and die here, or flee, and maybe survive long enough to die somewhere else. Neither felt like victory, but kings didn't survive through noble deaths. They survived through ugly, desperate choices that pride couldn't afford. Move, he told himself. Move or die here, like a dog in the dark. The wolves helped him stand. He leaned on the largest, Fenrir, his bonded companion since the creature was a pup. Blood smeared across gray fur. Together, they stumbled through the shattered wall into mountain passages beyond. Behind them, palace bells began ringing. Alarm, invasion, crisis, or celebration, depending on whose story won the night. Vaelor fled into darkness, leaving behind the empire he'd built, the throne he'd earned, the life he'd believed unshakable. The Alpha King had lost everything. Now he'd discover what remained when crowns and kingdoms fell away, leaving only the man beneath, and whether that man deserved to survive. The Ashen River ran black under moonlight, its current violent with spring melt and mountain runoff. Vaelor crashed through undergrowth along the cliffside path, each step grinding broken ribs against lung tissue. Blood soaked through his torn shirt, mixing with sweat and river spray. The wolves flanked him. 3 had survived the palace escape, massive gray shadows moving through darkness with lethal grace. Behind them, distant shouts echoed off stone. Torches bobbed like fireflies. Cassian's men spreading through the mountain passages, hunting their king like wounded prey. And that's exactly what he was now. Wounded. Prey. No longer predator. The path narrowed to barely 2 feet wide, cliff dropping 300 feet to churning water below. Vaelor's boots slipped on loose stone. He caught himself against rock face, shoulder wound screaming protest. Fresh blood painted the granite. "Keep moving," he commanded himself. "Stop and die. Simple mathematics." But his body argued different mathematics. Blood loss. Shock. Tissue damage reaching critical thresholds. The human machine had limits, and Vaelor was slamming into them at terminal velocity. A crossbow bolt sparked off rock inches from his head. Vaelor spun, instinct overriding pain. 20 yards back, palace guards emerged onto the cliff path. 4 men, weapons drawn, murder in their eyes and gold in their pockets. The lead guard, Captain Reese, a man Vaelor had promoted personally, raised his crossbow for another shot. No speech, no dramatic confrontation, just business. That hurt worse than the wounds. Vaelor drew his blade with his offhand, his dominant shoulder too damaged for the grip. The sword felt wrong, balance shifted, leverage compromised. He'd trained ambidextrous like all serious warriors, but training and survival occupied different continents. "Come on then," Vaelor said. His voice came rough, edged with something that might have been amusement or might have been approaching madness. "Let's see what your treason bought you." The guards advanced cautiously. They knew what he was, had been. An Alpha King didn't become undefeated through luck. He became undefeated by being the most dangerous thing in any room, even when that room was a cliff path in darkness with death waiting in every direction. Fenrir growled low, a sound that vibrated through stone itself. The other wolves spread into attack formation, but Reese had planned for this. He raised his hand, and from behind the guards came handlers with long spears tipped in silver. Metal wolves feared on instinct level. "Smart," Vaelor thought distantly. "Cassian trained you well." The wolves could fight, Vaelor could fight. Maybe they'd kill all 4 guards, but the noise would bring more. And eventually, numbers crushed even the most savage resistance. Vaelor made a calculation that tasted like ash. He whistled, sharp specific pattern the wolves knew from training. The command for retreat, for survival over loyalty. Fenrir's ears flattened. The wolf's eyes met his, and Vaelor saw understanding there, saw the refusal building. "Go," Vaelor said quietly. "Live. That's an order from your alpha." For 3 heartbeats, the wolf didn't move. Then Fenrir turned and vanished into darkness, the other wolves following. Their departure felt like another betrayal, even though Vaelor had commanded it, even though it was the only mercy he could offer creatures who'd already bled for him. Now it was just Vaelor and 4 men on a cliff path barely wide enough for one. The advantage was his, if advantage meant anything when you were bleeding out. Rhys fired. The bolt took Vaelor in the left thigh, punching through muscle and scraping bone. Vaelor's leg buckled. He caught himself on his sword, using it like a cane. The pain was extraordinary, not sharp, not clean, just overwhelming system failure, body screaming that it couldn't continue, that survival required stopping, lying down, accepting the end. Vaelor stepped forward instead. Because here's what civilians never understood about warriors. Pain was information, not instruction. You acknowledged it, filed it away, and kept moving until moving became impossible. He wasn't there yet. Close. But not yet. The first guard reached him. Young kid, maybe 25, probably desperate for gold to feed a family. Vaelor didn't care about his story. Couldn't afford sympathy when sympathy got you killed. He caught the guard's sword thrust with his blade, twisted, and drove his pommel into the kid's throat. Cartilage crunched. The guard dropped, choking. The second guard came faster, learning from his companion's mistake. He feinted high, struck low, forcing Vaelor to shift weight onto his destroyed thigh. Vaelor's leg gave out. He went down on one knee, sword barely deflecting a strike that would have opened his skull. The cliff edge was right there, inches away, empty air and certain death. The third guard kicked Vaelor's blade from his grip. It spun over the cliff, disappearing into darkness. Unarmed now. Wounded. Kneeling on stone while men he'd once commanded closed in for execution. This is how it ends, part of Vaelor thought with strange clarity. Not in glorious battle, not defending something that mattered, just murdered on a cliff path by mercenaries following orders. His body dumped in a river to wash away like garbage. The Empire would never know. History would record whatever lie Cassian and Cerys invented. The Alpha King who united Valtheris would become footnote, cautionary tale, forgotten mistake, unless he refused that ending. Vaelor surged upward, ignoring his body's screaming protest. He grabbed the third guard's sword arm, twisted with every ounce of remaining strength, and used the man's momentum to hurl him over the cliff edge. The guard's scream cut off with sudden, final silence. But the move cost Vaelor his balance. He teetered on the path edge, arms windmilling, weight shifting over empty space. The fourth guard, Rhys, stepped forward with his crossbow raised. "Should have stayed in your palace, your majesty." Rhys's voice carried regret that felt genuine. "Should have accepted retirement with grace. Should have trusted better people," Vaelor said. Then he let himself fall backward off the cliff. Not surrender, strategy. Because falling backward meant controlling the angle. And 300 feet of empty air meant 3 seconds to make a choice about how you wanted to hit water. Vaelor twisted mid-fall, body remembering dive training from decades ago. He straightened his form, arms tight against his sides, praying the river ran deep enough and that his wounded body could survive impact that killed most men. The ashen river rose up like black stone. Vaelor hit the water at terminal velocity. Everything became pain and cold and liquid darkness. The current took him. Not gentle, not caring, just physics dragging meat and bone downstream through rapids that smashed against rocks and churned through narrow channels. Vaelor tumbled through underwater darkness, lungs burning, wounds screaming, consciousness threatening to dissolve. His body slammed into submerged stones. His head cracked against something solid. Stars exploded behind his eyes. He broke surface, gasped air, went under again. The Ashen River had killed experienced swimmers in calm conditions. In spring flood, wounded and bleeding, Vaelor's survival odds approached 0. But 0 wasn't nothing. 0 was the margin where desperation operated. He forced his remaining functional arm to move, trying to angle toward calmer water. The current fought him. His strength faded. The cold seeped deeper, numbing everything, making survival feel optional rather than imperative. "Maybe just let go," part of him whispered. "Stop fighting. The Empire's lost. Everything's lost. What's the point of surviving into worse suffering?" That voice sounded reasonable, sounded almost kind. Vaelor told it to fuck off and kept swimming. Not because he had a plan, not because hope existed, but because quitting felt like giving Cassian and Cerys exactly what they wanted. Validation that they were right to betray him, that he'd been weak all along, that power was the only thing that mattered, and without power, he was nothing. Spite kept him alive when survival instinct failed. Spite and the bone-deep refusal to let traitors write his ending. The river carried him miles downstream, past the capital, past frontier settlements, into wilderness where human presence faded and nature reclaimed dominance. Finally, the current eased. The river widened into slower channels bordered by cedar forests. Vaelor's fingers touched something solid. Mud bank. Salvation or just slower death, depending on what happened next. He dragged himself from the water with movements that barely qualified as locomotion. More like drowning in reverse. His body had shut down everything non-essential. He crawled 3 feet up the bank and collapsed face first in mud. Darkness took him. Not death. Not yet. Just consciousness surrendering to damage too extensive for awareness to process. The last thing he heard was his own breathing, ragged, wet, improbable. The last thing he felt was rain beginning to fall, washing blood into soil that didn't care about kings or empires. Fever dreams held him for unknowable time. Vaelor walked through palace corridors that shifted like water. Cerys laughed from every doorway, her face multiplying into hundreds of identical smiles. Cassian stood on the throne, wearing a crown made of Vaelor's bones. "You never loved anything," Cerys said. Her voice echoed from walls and ceiling. "You possessed, you controlled, you commanded. But love? You don't even know what that word means." "I built an empire," Vaelor argued. "Doesn't that count?" "You built a monument to fear," Cassian said, "and monuments crumble. They all crumble eventually." The palace dissolved into river water. Vaelor drowned again and again, each death replaying with slight variations. Sometimes he hit rocks. Sometimes the current held him under until his lungs burst. Sometimes he simply dissolved into the water itself, becoming nothing, forgetting he'd ever been anything. Those deaths felt preferable to waking. But wake he did, slowly, painfully, dragged back to consciousness by sensations that insisted on being acknowledged. Warmth first, not fever heat, but external warmth. Fire maybe, blankets definitely. Then smell, wood smoke, herb tea, something cooking, broth with vegetables and meat. Finally, voices. Female, youngish, calm. His wounds needed cleaning hours ago. "I've done what I can, but infection's already setting in. The shoulder especially. Will he survive? Maybe. Depends on whether he wants to. I've seen men die from wounds half as bad because they gave up fighting, and I've seen men survive worse because they were too stubborn to quit. What kind of man survives falling off a cliff and washing up 40 miles downstream? The dangerous kind, or the desperate kind? Possibly both." Vaelor opened his eyes. Wrong decision. Light stabbed through his skull like hot needles. He groaned before he could stop himself. The voices paused. Footsteps approached. A shadow fell across him, blocking the light. "Easy," the female voice said. "Don't try to move. You've got a crossbow bolt wound in your thigh, 3 broken ribs, shoulder damage I can't fully assess, and a concussion that should have killed you. Moving right now is the worst idea you've had all week. And judging by your condition, you've had some real bad ideas lately." Vaelor's vision focused slowly. He lay in a small room, cabin maybe, with rough timber walls and a low ceiling. Fire crackled in a stone hearth. The air smelled clean, like cedar and rain-washed earth. And standing over him was a woman who looked nothing like the courtiers he'd known. Early 30s, maybe. Shoulder-length dark hair pulled back practical tight. Weathered skin that spoke of outdoor work. Lean muscle visible beneath simple wool shirt and leather vest. Hands that showed scars from labor rather than decoration. Eyes the color of storm clouds, gray-blue and assessing him with the same detached evaluation she might give an injured horse. Not beautiful by court standards, too rough, too real, but striking in ways that pierced through Vaelor's fever haze. "Where am I?" His voice came out destroyed, barely recognizable. "My home," the woman said. "Small settlement called Cedar Ford, 40 miles south of the capital. I found you on the riverbank 3 days ago, more dead than alive. Hauled you back here because leaving wounded men to die offends me philosophically." 3 days. Vaelor processed that. 3 days since the assassination. 3 days for Cassian and Cerys to consolidate power. 3 days for his empire to accept new leadership. 3 days for him to become officially dead. "What's your name?" the woman asked. Vaelor hesitated. His identity was currency now. Dangerous currency. If word spread that the Alpha King survived, Cassian would send everything to finish the job. "Vael," he said. The lie felt strange. "Just Vael. Convenient how just Vael washed up in my territory wearing ruined but expensive clothes, carrying sword calluses that suggest serious military training, and sporting wounds consistent with professional violence rather than random bad luck." The woman's tone stayed neutral, but her eyes missed nothing. "I'm Lyran Ashvale. I breed horses, practice medicine when needed, and occasionally pull mysterious strangers from rivers. I don't ask questions I don't want answered, but I also don't tolerate being lied to in my own home." Vaelor met her gaze. "I'm not who I was 3 days ago. That's not a lie." "Fair enough." Lyran moved to a small table, returning with a clay cup. "Drink this. It's willow bark tea for pain and fever. Tastes like punishment, but it works." She helped him sit up. Process that required gritted teeth and several false starts. Every muscle screamed, his shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. The thigh wound felt hot and swollen, but he was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. The tea tasted as advertised. Bitter, harsh, unpleasant. Vaelor drank it anyway. Lyran watched him with those storm-gray eyes. "You military?" "Was. Discharged?" Something like that. "Run away from something? Or to something?" "Both," Vaelor said. "Neither." "I don't know yet." Lyran nodded slowly. "Well, just Vael, you're welcome to stay until you can walk without falling over, but understand the terms. You work for your keep once you're able. I'm not running charity here. Wood needs chopping, fences need mending, horses need tending. You contribute or you leave. I can work. We'll see." She stood, moving toward the door. "Rest now. Your body's been through trauma. Recovery takes time, whether you like it or not." She paused at the threshold. "One more thing. Whatever you're running from, it doesn't matter here. Cedar Ford doesn't care about politics or titles or whatever drama happened in the capital. We care about work done honest and neighbors helping neighbors. Keep that in mind." She left. Vaelor sat alone in the small room, holding a clay cup of bitter tea wrapped in blankets that smelled like cedar and horse. The Alpha King of Valtheris. Undefeated conqueror, builder of empires, reduced to just Vael, a wounded stranger dependent on mercy from a woman who bred horses. The irony would have been funny if it didn't cut so deep. He finished the tea, lay back down, and tried not to think about everything he'd lost. Failed, obviously, but failure was becoming familiar territory. Recovery took weeks, not days. Vaelor's body fought infection, fever, and damage that should have been fatal. Lyran treated him with herbs, poultices, and ruthlessly practical care that involved zero sympathy and maximum competence. "You run fevers like this regularly?" she asked one night while changing bandages on his shoulder. "Not usually," Vaelor managed through gritted teeth. "Well, your body's fighting hard." "That's good. Means you're too stubborn to die. Stubbornness counts for more than people think. Is that medical wisdom? That's life wisdom. Medicine just keeps the body functioning while the will decides whether it's worth continuing." She tied off the bandage with efficient movements. "You've got strong will. Stupid, maybe, but strong." "Thanks," Vaelor said dryly. "Don't thank me yet. You're going to hate physical therapy." She wasn't wrong. As his wounds healed enough for movement, Lyran put him through exercises that made combat training feel gentle. Stretching damaged tissue, rebuilding atrophied muscle, relearning balance after concussion and blood loss. Move through the pain, not around it, she instructed while he struggled to lift a wooden bucket overhead. The shoulder needs to remember its full range. Babying it just makes recovery longer. Pretty sure I'm not babying it, Vaelor panted. Pretty sure I'm actively dying. You're complaining. That means you're healing. Dead men don't complain. This your bedside manner with all patients? Only the ones who showed up half dead with mysterious wounds and obvious lies? She smiled slightly. Special treatment. Despite himself, Vaelor found the routine grounding. Wake before dawn. Exercise until his body screamed. Help with chores, feeding horses, mending fence posts, chopping wood for winter stores. Simple labor that required focus and effort but no complex strategy. No councils. No politics. No weighing whether executing a rebel would prevent future rebellion or create martyrs. Just work. Physical, immediate, honest. Something in him unclenched during those weeks. Cedar Ford settlement held maybe 50 people spread across family homesteads. They noticed the stranger living with Lyran, but didn't pry. Mountain folk, Lyran explained, valued privacy as much as community. You helped your neighbors when needed, respected boundaries otherwise. Vaelor met them gradually. Old Marcus, who raised sheep and told stories about the War of Eastern Succession like he'd been there, which he probably had. Young Tessa, whose family ran the mill and who watched Vaelor with suspicious curiosity. The Brennan brothers, hunters who supplied settlement meat and treated everyone with easy camaraderie. None of them knew who he was, what he'd been. To them, he was just Vael, Lyran's patient-turned-laborer, quiet, competent, damaged but recovering. The anonymity felt like freedom and imprisonment simultaneously. One evening, while repairing fence posts near Lyran's horse pasture, Vaelor paused to watch sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. The view stretched for miles, cedar forests, river valley, distant peaks still wearing snow. Beautiful, simple, untouched by empire politics. "How did you end up here?" Vaelor asked. Lyran worked nearby, treating a mare's injured hoof. She glanced up. "Here specifically, or this life generally?" "Both. Born in the capital, actually. Father was a merchant. Did well for himself, made connections, climbed the social ladder. She returned to examining the hoof. When I was 16, he decided I should marry some lord's third son. Strategic alliance, he called it. I called it being sold like livestock. What happened? I left. Took my horse, my medical supplies, whatever food I could carry, rode until I found somewhere that didn't care about family connections or political value. She smiled without humor. Turned out Cedar Ford fit that description perfectly. Your father looked for you? Probably. Never found me, though. Or maybe he did and decided a runaway daughter wasn't worth the embarrassment of dragging back. She shrugged. Either way, I built a life here. Learned horse breeding from old Marcus, studied healing from the previous settlement doctor, earned respect through work rather than inheritance. Best decision I ever made. Vaelor absorbed that. No regrets? About leaving? None. About how my father's probably ashamed of me? She met his eyes directly. Not even a little. You can't build a life trying to satisfy people who see you as commodity rather than person. The words landed with weight Lyran couldn't have intended. Vaelor thought about Ceres, about how their marriage had been transaction, not partnership, about how he'd treated her as asset to his empire rather than individual with her own wants and needs. Maybe she'd been wrong to betray him, but maybe he'd been wrong first. That thought disturbed him more than the betrayal itself, because betrayal was simple, clean, gave him clear villain to hate. Complexity was harder, required acknowledging his own failures, required admitting that power didn't excuse blindness, that strength couldn't replace understanding. You're thinking too hard, Lyran observed. Smoke's practically coming from your ears. Just realizing I might have been an asshole, Vaelor said. Might have been? She laughed. Anyone who shows up bleeding from professional violence definitely was an asshole at some point. Question is whether you're done being one. Still figuring that out. Well, you've got time. Healing takes as long as it takes. She returned to treating the horse, conversation closed. But Vaelor kept thinking about who he'd been, who he was now, whether the difference mattered, and whether a king stripped of crown could learn to be just a man. The truth was, Vaelor had spent 20 years believing that power equaled purpose, that commanding armies and ruling territories gave his existence meaning, that the empire he built justified every sacrifice, every brutal decision, every relationship reduced to strategic value. But here, chopping wood for Lyron's winter stores, his hands blistered and arms aching from honest labor, he felt something he hadn't experienced in the palace: usefulness without performance. No one watched to judge whether he chopped wood with kingly dignity. No one cared if his technique impressed or his output exceeded expectations. The work simply needed doing, and he did it. That simplicity unsettled him. Because if meaning existed in simple work, what did that say about the complexity he'd built? If splitting logs mattered as much as splitting kingdoms, what had he actually accomplished? These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that undermined everything he'd believed about himself. But Lyron's settlement operated on different principles than his empire. Here, old Marcus commanded respect not through title or military achievement, but through decades of consistent help to neighbors. Young Tessa held influence not through political maneuvering, but through running the mill reliably, fairly, without seeking advantage over those who depended on her. Power here meant capacity to contribute, not capacity to dominate. And watching that system function, Vaelor began questioning whether his empire had genuinely served its people or merely served his need to believe he mattered. That question haunted him more than Cassian's betrayal. Tut-tut. 4 weeks into his recovery, Vaelor worked alone in Lyron's barn, mucking stalls and replacing hay bedding. Physical labor that required attention but not thought, perfect for a mind trying to avoid its own questions. The barn door opened. Lyron entered, leading a gray mare with obvious limp. "Help me with this," she said without preamble. "Front left leg. Something's wrong, but I can't see what." Vaelor set aside his pitchfork and approached. The mare shifted nervously, sensing unfamiliar presence. "Easy," Vaelor murmured, his voice dropping into tones he'd used with war horses decades ago. "Nobody's hurting you." He ran his hand down the mare's leg, feeling for heat, swelling, anything abnormal. The horse flinched when he touched just above the hoof. "There," he said. "Abscess, maybe. Or stone bruise." Lyron crouched beside him, examining where he'd indicated. "You know horses." "Used to. Long time ago." "Military cavalry?" Vaelor hesitated. His entire life was lies now, careful omissions and half-truths to protect a secret that felt increasingly pointless. What did it matter who he'd been when that person was dead? "Something like that," he said finally. Lyron glanced at him, those storm-gray eyes seeing too much. "You're good at evasion, must have practiced a lot, survival skill, or control tactic." She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. People who can't be honest usually can't trust either, and people who can't trust end up alone. "I'm not alone. I'm here. Are you?" Lyron's voice stayed level, but challenge threaded through it. "Because you've been here 4 weeks, and I still don't know anything real about you. Where you're from, what you did before, why you showed up bleeding in my river. You work hard, I'll give you that. You're competent, and you don't complain. But you're about as present as a ghost. What do you want to know?" "Everything. Nothing. Whatever you're willing to share without the performance." She met his eyes. "I don't need your secrets, Vael, but I need to know if you're actually here or just hiding in proximity to other people." The words cut deeper than intended. Because Lyron was right. He'd spent 4 weeks working beside these people without actually connecting to them. Kept everyone at careful distance while pretending integration. Used the same political skills that served him in court. Appear engaged while revealing nothing. Create impression of openness while maintaining absolute control. He was performing humanity rather than living it. "I don't know how to be here," Vaelor said quietly. The admission felt like failure. "I don't know how to be anything except what I was. And what I was got me thrown off a cliff and left for dead. So build something different. Just like that? Just like that." Lyron shrugged. "You think you're special because your old life failed? Everyone here left something behind. Old Marcus fought in wars that destroyed his faith in authority. Tessa's parents fled debt they couldn't pay in the capital. The Brennan brothers escaped family expectations that would have crushed them. We're all rebuilding from wreckage. You're not unique." The bluntness should have offended him. Instead, it grounded him. Because Lyron was right again. He'd been treating his situation like unprecedented tragedy when it was actually commonplace human experience. Loss happened. Betrayal happened. Lives collapsed and people rebuilt, or they didn't. The only question was which category he'd occupy. How do I start? He asked. Stop performing, Lyran said. Stop calculating what version of yourself seems safest. Just be whoever you actually are right now, in this moment, without the armor. And if who I actually am is broken, then you're broken. That's fine. Broken still contributes. Broken still matters. She moved toward the barn door, then paused. But you can't heal what you won't acknowledge, and you definitely can't build new life while pretending the old one didn't matter. She left him alone with the horses and his thoughts. Vaelor stood in the dim barn, smelling hay and horse and his own sweat from honest work. Outside, Cedar Ford continued its daily rhythm. Marcus tending sheep, Tessa working the mill, Brennan brothers tracking game through forests. Simple lives. Honest lives. Lives built on presence rather than performance. Could he do that? Actually be present? Stop treating every interaction like negotiation and every conversation like intelligence gathering. The prospect terrified him, because without performance, without control, without the careful masks that protected him, who was he? Just a man, maybe. Flawed and frightened and fundamentally uncertain whether he deserved the second chance Lyran offered. But maybe that was enough. Maybe being just a man, present and honest and willing to fail, was more valuable than being an alpha king who commanded empires but connected to nothing. Vaelor returned to mucking stalls, but something shifted inside him. Some long-held tension releasing, some armor cracking enough to let reality touch skin. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was the first honest step toward it. 6 weeks after his arrival, messengers came through Cedar Ford. They rode hard-quality horses, military-bearing, searching faces with methodical attention. Vaelor watched from inside Lyran's barn, staying out of sight while adrenaline spiked through his system. The lead rider stopped near the settlement center, addressing the handful of locals who'd gathered. By order of Queen Regent Cerys Vale and General Cassian Thorne, a reward is offered for information leading to the capture of traitors who conspired against the crown. King Vaelor Draven was assassinated by foreign agents. Any suspicious individuals should be reported immediately. Vaelor's hands clenched. Assassinated by foreign agents. Clean narrative. Blamed external enemies, united the kingdom against common threat, absolved Cerys and Cassian of suspicion. Brilliant strategy. Exactly what he would have done. The messenger continued describing supposed traitors, vague descriptions that could fit anyone. Then they rode on, spreading their lies to the next settlement. After they left, Lyran found Vaelor in the barn. So, she said conversationally, King's been dead 6 weeks apparently. Assassinated? Terrible tragedy. Empire in mourning. Vaelor said nothing. Funny thing though, Lyran continued, timeline matches exactly when you washed up half dead in my river. And those messengers seemed real interested in finding someone who might have survived wounds that should have been fatal. Still, Vaelor stayed silent. I told you I don't ask questions I don't want answered, Lyran said. Her voice remained calm, but tension threaded through it. But when armed men from the capital start hunting traitors in my settlement, I need to know what I'm protecting. Vaelor turned to face her. You want the truth? I want to know if keeping you here puts my neighbors in danger. Fair question. He took a breath. The king wasn't assassinated by foreign agents. He was betrayed by his queen and his general. They tried to kill him, failed. Now they're hunting him to finish the job. Lyran absorbed that. And you know this how? Because I'm him. The words hung between them like blade edge. Lyran's expression didn't change immediately. She studied him with those storm gray eyes, reassessing everything. You're Vaelor Draven. The Alpha King. Was. Not anymore. That's not how kingship works. Apparently it is, Vaelor said, because the kingdom accepted my death without question. The empire moved on, which means either they didn't care or Cassian's control is absolute enough to suppress dissent. Or both, Lyran said quietly. Or both. She walked to the barn entrance, looking out at the settlement. People working, living, existing in the simple rhythm of daily survival. Those messengers will come back, she said. If they find you here, they'll burn Cedar Ford to the ground to eliminate witnesses. Vaelor nodded. I know. That's why I'm leaving tonight. No. Vaelor blinked. What? You're not leaving. Lyran turned back to him. You're barely recovered. Push too hard too fast, your wounds reopen and you die on some forest trail where nobody finds you for weeks. Better than bringing war to your doorstep. Already did that when I pulled you from the river. She crossed her arms. Besides, you think I'm scared of some capital messengers? I left that world specifically because I refused to let powerful men dictate my choices. Not starting now. This isn't politics, Vaelor said. This is survival. They'll kill you. They can try. Lyran's voice carried steel. But Cedar Forge survived before the Empire, and we'll survive after. We're not helpless farmers waiting for someone to protect us. We're frontier people who learned self-sufficiency when the capital was too busy with its own drama to notice we existed. Vaelor shook his head. You don't understand what Cassian... I understand plenty. She stepped closer. I understand you spent 6 weeks healing here, learning to be person instead of title. And now danger comes. Your first instinct is to run rather than trust the people who saved you. That's exactly what it is. You're still thinking like a king, still assuming you fight alone, still believing power is the only currency that matters. Power's the only currency that keeps people alive. Wrong, Lyran said flatly. Community keeps people alive. Trust keeps people alive. Mutual protection and shared resources and giving a damn about your neighbors. That's what keeps people alive when power fails. Vaelor wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that she was naive, that idealism collapsed under real threat, that he'd spent 20 years learning brutal lessons about how the world actually worked. But he'd also spent 6 weeks watching Cedar Forge function through cooperation rather than dominance. Watching Lyran heal injuries and breed horses and help neighbors without expecting payment. Watching a community survive through principles his empire had forgotten. Maybe she wasn't naive. Maybe he'd been blind. If I stay, people will die, Vaelor said quietly. That's not philosophy. That's fact. If you leave, you'll die, Lyran countered. Also fact. So we make a third choice. You stay. We prepare. And when trouble comes, because it will come, we handle it together. You trust me that much? After knowing who I am? I trust that you've spent 6 weeks proving you're more than what you were. She held his gaze. But yeah, trust is required. Because survival without trust isn't survival. It's just prolonged dying. Vaelor had conquered kingdoms through force, had built an empire through discipline and violence, had commanded armies that made nations submit. And here stood one woman with storm-gray eyes offering something his empire never had. Belief that he could be more than his worst self. The offer terrified him more than any battle. Because battles he understood. Violence had rules, logic, predictable outcomes. Trust was chaos. Required vulnerability. Meant accepting that other people's choices affected your survival. Meant admitting you couldn't control everything. That admission might kill him faster than Cassian's soldiers. But staying here, in this settlement that valued work over titles, surrounded by people who saw him as just Vael rather than Alpha King, that offered something he hadn't felt since before the crown. The possibility that he mattered beyond what he could command. All right, Vaelor said finally. We prepare together. Lyran nodded once. Good. Now let's figure out how to keep everyone alive when your empire comes looking for you. They worked through the night, planning defenses that combined Cedar Forge's frontier knowledge with Vaelor's military strategy. Vaelor sketched defensive positions in dirt outside the barn. If they send soldiers, they'll approach from the main road here. Standard formation would be 20 to 30 men, enough to overwhelm resistance, but not so many they attract attention from other settlements. We've got the river on west side, Lyran said, crouching beside him. Cliffs to the north. That funnels them through 2 approaches, main road south or forest trail east. Forest trail's too narrow for organized assault. They'll use main road. Vaelor marked positions with stones. We need lookouts here and here. Early warning matters more than strong defense. If we know they're coming, we control the engagement. What about civilians? Old Marcus, the children, people who can't fight. Evacuate them north to the caves before soldiers arrive. Lyran had mentioned those caves, old mining tunnels from before the Empire, now used for storage. Deep, hidden, defensible. They planned for hours. Identifying choke points. Stockpiling weapons. Mostly hunting equipment and farm tools. But Vaelor knew how to make any object lethal. Establishing signals for emergency communication. This assumes they send soldiers, Lyron said eventually. What if they send assassins instead? Small group, surgical strike? Then we're already dead, Vaelor said bluntly. Assassins trained by Cassian won't announce themselves. But assassination requires knowing exactly where I am. Right now they're searching blind. Soldiers are more likely, enough force to investigate rumors and eliminate witnesses. Cheerful thought. I don't deal in cheerful. I deal in survival. Lyron studied him in the darkness. You've done this before. Defended against overwhelming odds. Many times. Vaelor's voice went distant. Frostbreak Ridge? We held 500 against 3,000 for 2 days. Thornhaven Siege. 30 of us survived 3 weeks, surrounded by hostile forces. The key isn't winning. The key is making victory cost more than they're willing to pay. And if they're willing to pay everything, then we make them pay it. Simple as that. Simple. They sat in silence, both understanding what that meant. Blood, death. The kind of violence that stained ground, and memory equally. Your empire, Lyron said quietly. Was it worth it? All those battles, all those sacrifices. Did it actually achieve what you wanted? Vaelor considered the question. Honest answer? I don't know. I built something that unified territories, ended constant warfare, created stability. People lived safer lives under my rule than before. But I also became someone who measured success in conquered territory rather than improved lives, who treated people as resources rather than purpose. And now? Now I'm not sure the difference between building empire and feeding ego. Maybe they're inseparable. Maybe every king convinces himself his ambition serves others when really it just serves itself. That's pretty dark. That's pretty honest. Vaelor met her eyes. But here's what I learned these 6 weeks. Cedar Ford doesn't need an alpha king. It needs people willing to work, willing to help neighbors, willing to build something together. That's more valuable than anything I accomplished with armies. Because it's sustainable, Lyron said. Power gained through force requires constant force to maintain. Power gained through cooperation maintains itself. Exactly. Vaelor smiled without humor. Wish I'd understood that 20 years ago. Would have saved considerable suffering. Maybe, or maybe you needed to build an empire and lose it to learn what actually matters. Philosophical wisdom from a horse breeder. I'm full of surprises. She stood, brushing dirt from her pants. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start preparing everyone. And Vael? Yeah? Thank you for being honest. She headed toward her cabin, then called back over her shoulder. And for the record, I like who you're becoming better than who you were. She disappeared inside, leaving Vaelor alone under stars that didn't care about kings or empires. He looked up at that indifferent sky and felt something unfamiliar. Not quite hope, not yet peace, but maybe the beginning of both. Chaparran, 2 weeks of preparation. Vaelor trained Cedar Ford residents in basic defensive tactics. Not trying to make them warriors, that took years, but teaching them how to use terrain, how to strike from cover, how to retreat strategically rather than panic. Old Marcus proved surprisingly competent with bow and arrow. Decades of hunting translated to combat archery easier than expected. The man might be 70, but his hands stayed steady and his eyes stayed sharp. You fought in the Eastern Succession, didn't you? Vaelor asked during target practice. Marcus smiled grimly. 3 years in the mud watching boys die for lords' ambitions. Learned real quick that wars serve power, not people. What made you stop? Common sense. Marcus knocked another arrow. Realized I was killing strangers to make rich men richer. Came out here where nobody cared about their petty empire games. You ever regret leaving? Every damn day. Marcus released. The arrow split his previous shot down the center. But regret doesn't mean wrong choice, just means choices cost, and you pay the price. The Brennan brothers, Cale and Torin, took to tactics naturally. Hunters understood ambush, understood patience, understood reading environment for advantage. Soldiers will move in formation, Vaelor explained while they scouted the main road approach. That's their strength and their weakness. Formation means coordination but also predictability. You hit from unexpected angles, you break formation, they lose advantage. How many you think they'll send? Kael asked. Depends on how seriously they take the rumors. 20 minimum. 40 maximum. More than that attracts too much attention. Can we actually win against those numbers? Vaelor looked at the brothers. Win means different things. If win means killing every soldier? No. If win means making the attack cost enough they don't come back? Maybe. And if we lose? Then we make sure our families are already gone, Torn said quietly. His brother nodded. These men understood what Vaelor was asking. Understood they might die defending homes from empire that should have protected them. They prepared anyway, because that's what frontier people did. Survived through cooperation when power abandoned them. Lyran organized the evacuation plan. Civilians would retreat to the caves at first warning. Fighters would delay soldiers long enough for everyone else to vanish. How long you need? Vaelor asked. 30 minutes minimum, Lyran said. Longer if we have wounded or young children. I'll give you an hour. You can't promise that. Watch me. They stared at each other, both recognizing the weight of that promise. An hour meant holding position against trained soldiers, meant accepting casualties, meant Vaelor stepping back into the role he'd tried to abandon, meant becoming the Alpha King again, even briefly. I thought you left that behind, Lyran said. I did, but it left me with skills that matter right now. Vaelor's voice stayed level. I'm not going back to being what I was, but I can use what I learned to protect what matters now. And after? After, we figure out who I am when I'm not fighting. Lyran studied him, then nodded. 1 hour. Don't die earning it. Wasn't planning on it. People rarely do. The assassins came on a night when moon hid behind clouds and darkness pressed thick enough to touch. Not soldiers. Vaelor had been wrong about that. Cassian sent professionals. The first warning came from Kael, stationed on lookout near the forest trail. His signal, 3 sharp whistles, cut through the darkness. Vaelor moved instantly, muscle memory overriding thought. He grabbed weapons stashed in Lyran's barn and ran toward the settlement center. Lyran emerged from her cabin, already moving. How many? Don't know yet. But they bypassed the main road. That's professional behavior. The evacuation started immediately. Lyran led civilians north toward the caves, while Vaelor, Marcus, and the Brennan brothers formed defensive line near settlement center. Then shadows moved between buildings. Not obvious, not loud, just sudden presence where nothing had been. 6 figures dressed in dark leather, faces covered, weapons drawn with professional efficiency. Cassian's elite. The men who handled problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. Vaelor's blood went cold. Not from fear, from recognition. He'd commanded these men, trained with them, knew exactly how dangerous they were. This wasn't a raid, this was execution. The lead assassin stepped forward, his voice muffled behind cloth mask. Vaelor Draven, you've led us on quite the chase. Didn't realize I was running, Vaelor said. Thought I was dead. Obviously not dead enough. The assassin drew twin blades. General Cassian sends his regards, and has promised that this time you stay dead. No more conversation, no dramatic speeches, just violence. The assassins moved like smoke, spreading to surround their targets. Professional, coordinated, lethal. Vaelor fought like he hadn't fought in months. Not restrained, not calculated, just pure survival instinct refined through decades of staying alive when better men died. He caught the first assassin's blade on his sword, twisted, and drove his knee into the man's gut. The assassin stumbled. Vaelor's blade opened his throat before he hit ground. 1 down, 5 to go. Marcus's bow sang. An arrow took the second assassin through the chest. The man fell without sound. 2 down. But the remaining 4 adjusted, spreading wider, using darkness and buildings for cover. The Brennan brothers fought back to back, their hunting knives flashing. They wounded one assassin badly enough he retreated, disappearing into shadows. 3 active threats. Vaelor's shoulder wound screamed as he parried another strike. His thigh, barely healed from the crossbow bolt, threatened to give out. But pain was information, not instruction. He kept moving, kept fighting, kept refusing death. The lead assassin was good, better than the others. He matched Vaelor strike for strike, his technique flawless. You've lost a step, the assassin said conversationally, while their blades sparked in darkness. Age catches everyone eventually. Still faster than you, Vaelor snarled. They clashed again, brutal exchange that ended with Vaelor's blade scraping across the assassin's ribs. Not fatal, but damaging. The assassin stumbled back, reassessing. Then Lyran appeared from nowhere, a horseshoe in her hand, and slammed it into the assassin's skull with enough force to drop him instantly. She stood over the fallen man, breathing hard. "Told you I'm full of surprises. Remind me never to underestimate you," Vaelor said. Around them, the fight ended. 4 assassins dead, 1 wounded and fled, 1 unconscious. Marcus and the Brennan brothers stood bloodied but alive. "Everyone okay?" Vaelor asked. "Define okay?" Kale said, pressing cloth against a shoulder wound. "But yeah, alive counts as okay." Vaelor moved to the unconscious assassin, pulling down his mask. Young face, maybe 25. Someone's son, someone's brother. Trained to kill without question, following orders because orders define purpose. Vaelor had built that system, had created soldiers who followed commands regardless of morality. Now those soldiers hunted him. The irony cut deep. "What do we do with him?" Lyran asked. Vaelor considered. Execution would be practical. The man would wake and either attack again or report back to Cassian. But execution felt wrong, felt like becoming what he'd left behind. "We let him go," Vaelor said. The others stared at him. "You're joking," Marcus said. "No. We patch his wounds, give him water, and send him back to the capital with a message." Vaelor met their eyes. "Tell Cassian that Vaelor Draven is dead. The man he knew, the king he betrayed. That person doesn't exist anymore. And whoever's hunting him now is chasing a ghost." "That's naive," Marcus said bluntly. "That boy wakes up. He'll come back with an army. Maybe. Or maybe he goes back and tells Cassian that a dead king isn't worth more resources. Either way, we don't become murderers to stop murderers." Lyran smiled slightly. "Who are you, and what did you do with the Alpha King?" "Killed him," Vaelor said. "Trying something different now." They treated the unconscious assassin's wounds, left him with water and supplies, and withdrew to the caves where civilians waited. The gamble was insane, possibly fatal. But Vaelor was done making decisions based purely on strategic advantage. If he died because he chose mercy over murder, at least he died as someone different than who he'd been. That felt like progress, even if progress killed him. 3 days later, word came back. A merchant passing through Cedar Ford mentioned rumors from the capital. The assassins sent to investigate frontier disturbances had been killed by unknown bandits. One survivor reported that the Alpha King's body was never found, but no evidence suggested he survived. The hunt was being called off. Too many resources spent chasing shadows. The Empire had real threats to address: border conflicts, internal dissent, economic troubles that came from rushed leadership changes. Cassian was letting it go, not from mercy, from pragmatism. A dead king obsessed over became bigger threat than a dead king forgotten. When Lyran told him, Vaelor felt something unexpected. Not relief, not quite. More like the closing of a chapter he'd written in blood and lost in water. "It's over then," he said. "That part is," Lyran agreed. "Now comes the harder part." "Which is?" "Figuring out what you do with freedom." Vaelor looked around Cedar Ford, at rebuilt fences and tended horses, at people who'd risked everything to protect a stranger, at a community that functioned through cooperation rather than dominance, at Lyran, watching him with those storm-gray eyes that saw through every pretense. "I think," Vaelor said slowly, "I start by being present. Actually here. Not planning the next move or controlling the next outcome. Just being where I am with people who matter. That's a start." "Just a start?" "Healing takes longer than 6 weeks. Building trust takes longer than a few conversations. Becoming someone new takes longer than winning one fight." Lyran smiled. "But you've got time, and you've got people willing to walk that path with you." "Why?" Vaelor asked. "Why invest in someone broken?" "Because broken isn't the same as worthless." She stepped closer. "Because everyone here is rebuilding from something, and because the man who chopped wood and mended fences and fought to protect neighbors, that man is worth the investment. Even if he was a terrible king, especially because he was. Means he knows what not to be." Vaelor absorbed that. For 20 years, he'd defined himself through conquest and control, through building an empire that bore his name and reflected his will. He'd lost that empire, lost that identity, lost everything that made him feel significant. And here, in a settlement that never cared about his significance, he'd found something more valuable. The possibility of mattering without dominating, of contributing without controlling, of being valued for presence rather than power. It wasn't the life he'd built, wasn't the destiny he'd imagined. But standing in Cedar Ford, surrounded by people who'd chosen to protect him not because of what he commanded, but because of who he might become, Vaelor felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not hope, exactly, but the foundation on which hope could be built. The Alpha King was dead, but the man who might rise from those ashes, scarred, humbled, fundamentally changed by betrayal and survival, that man had a chance at something no crown could purchase. A life earned through truth rather than taken through force. And that, Vaelor was beginning to understand, might be the only empire worth building. That night, Vaelor stood on the ridge above Cedar Ford, watching stars emerge as darkness deepened. Liren found him there. They stood in silence, both comfortable with the quiet. Finally, Liren spoke. "You're really staying?" "Yeah." Vaelor's voice carried certainty he didn't know he possessed. "I'm really staying, even though it means giving up the empire, the throne, everything you built, especially because of that." He turned to face her. "I spent 20 years building monuments to my own significance. Time I tried building something that actually matters." "And what's that?" "Don't know yet." Vaelor smiled slightly, "But I figure I'll start with being honest, being present, being someone who contributes without needing control. See where that leads. Might lead nowhere. Might lead somewhere better than an empire built on fear." Liren studied him. "You've changed. Getting betrayed, nearly killed, and washed up half dead in a stranger's river tends to adjust perspective. That's one way to phrase character development." They stood together, watching Cedar Ford settle into night. Lights in windows, smoke from chimneys, the simple, honest rhythm of lives lived without performance. "Thank you," Vaelor said quietly, "for saving me, for protecting me, for believing I could be more than what I was. You did the hard part. I just gave you space to do it. Still, thank you." Liren nodded, then asked the question that mattered. "What happens when you're fully healed? When you're strong enough to leave if you wanted?" "I stay anyway," Vaelor said, "unless you're kicking me out." "Not kicking you out. Just making sure you're choosing to stay, not defaulting because you don't have better options. I'm choosing." He met her eyes. "I'm choosing presence over power. I'm choosing community over control. I'm choosing to build a life that matters because of how I treat people, not how much I command them." "Good." Liren's expression softened. "Because I like having you here. Not the Alpha King, just you. Just me is pretty broken." "Broken works fine." She started back toward the settlement. "Come on. Tomorrow we've got horses to train and fences to mend. Being present means showing up for the work." Vaelor followed her down the ridge, leaving the stars and the past behind. The Alpha King was dead. Long lived the man who'd learned that survival without transformation was just slower dying. And transformation, Vaelor was discovering, required surrendering everything you thought defined you to discover what actually did. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was, finally, honest. And honesty, he was beginning to understand, was the only foundation worth building on. 3 months passed in Cedar Ford like water-smoothing stone, slowly reshaping everything it touched. Vaelor stopped being just Vael and became simply part of the settlement's rhythm. He worked Liren's horses, helped Marcus repair the sheep pen damaged by late spring storms, taught Tessa's younger brother basic sword work when the kid wouldn't stop pestering him. Small contributions, honest labor, the kind of life that built calluses on hands instead of scars on conscience. He and Liren fell into something that resembled partnership more than romance, though the boundary blurred on nights when they sat together watching stars and talking about nothing important. She didn't push. He didn't retreat. They existed in comfortable proximity, both understanding that healing required patience more than passion. The nightmares came less frequently. The phantom weight of the crown lifted gradually. Some mornings, Vaelor woke and forgot he'd ever been king. Forgot the throne, the armies, the empire built on discipline and blood. Those were the good mornings. The bad mornings, he remembered everything. Remembered Ceres's laugh echoing through false affection. Remembered Cassian's blade seeking his throat. Remembered the exact moment he understood that everything he'd built was sandcastle architecture, impressive until the tide came. On those mornings, Lyran found him before dawn, working himself to exhaustion chopping wood or mucking stalls. She never asked what haunted him, just worked beside him until the ghosts retreated. That was its own kind of mercy. Here's what Vaelor learned about rebuilding. It wasn't linear. Some days he felt genuinely present, genuinely free of who he'd been. Other days the old instincts surfaced, the need to control, to dominate, to treat every interaction like chess game requiring 3 moves ahead planning. Progress and regression occupied the same space, wrestling for dominance inside his skull. But the wrestling itself was progress, because the old Vaelor never questioned his instincts, never examined whether command was necessary or just habitual, never considered that power might be addiction rather than requirement. The new version, whatever he was becoming, questioned everything. That uncertainty felt like weakness some days, like strength others. Lyran called it growth. Vaelor called it confusion. They were probably both right. One afternoon in early summer, while Vaelor worked with a young stallion in Lyran's training corral, Marcus approached with expression that immediately triggered alarm instincts. "Got visitors," Marcus said. His voice carried carefully neutral tone that suggested the visitors weren't selling supplies or trading gossip. 3 riders, well-armed, asking about strangers who might have passed through months back. Vaelor's hand stilled on the horse's lead rope. His pulse kicked up, adrenaline flooding system with familiar readiness. The instincts he'd tried to bury surged back instantly. Tactical assessment, threat evaluation, calculating escape routes and defensive positions. 3 months of peace evaporating in 3 seconds. "Where?" Vaelor asked. "Settlement center. Talking to folks." Being polite about it, but the kind of polite that's really a threat. Marcus met his eyes. "They're not leaving without answers." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet. Figured you'd want to handle this yourself." Vaelor nodded slowly. His mind shifted gears, muscle memory taking over. The peaceful laborer retreating, the strategic king emerging. And he hated how easily that transition happened. Hated that 3 months of intentional change could be overwritten by simple external pressure. Maybe he hadn't changed at all. Maybe he'd just been hiding. "Tell Lyran," Vaelor said. "Make sure everyone knows to keep stories straight. Stranger came through months ago, helped with some work, moved on. Nobody knows where. And if they don't believe it, then we have bigger problems." Vaelor released the horse and started toward the settlement center. "Stay back. If this goes bad, I don't want you involved." "Little late for that," Marcus said, but he didn't follow. Vaelor walked through Cedar Ford with awareness sharpened to combat edge. Every shadow assessed, every sound cataloged, every person potentially threat or collateral damage. The peaceful settlement transformed into battlefield in his perception. Not because it was, but because his brain defaulted to that framework when danger appeared. And that default terrified him more than the actual danger, because it suggested that underneath all the healing, all the growth, all the intentional change, he was still the Alpha King, still the man who saw everything through violence and control, still broken in ways labor and kindness couldn't fix. The 3 riders stood near the settlement's central well, their horses drinking while they questioned Tessa's father. All 3 wore leather armor under traveling cloaks. Swords hung casual at their hips, not displayed aggressively, but present enough to make point. Professional soldiers trying to look like professional travelers. Vaelor recognized the type immediately. He'd commanded hundreds of them. He approached with posture deliberately relaxed, farmer returning from work, nothing threatening about him. But his weight balanced on balls of feet, ready to move. His hands stayed visible but within reach of the knife at his belt. Old habits. Life-saving habits. Habits he couldn't shake even when he desperately wanted to. The lead rider noticed him immediately. Eyes that missed nothing scanning Vaelor head to toe, calculating threat level, cataloging weapons and weaknesses. Their gazes locked, and Vaelor saw recognition flicker across the man's face. Not full recognition, but something. Familiarity. Like seeing someone in wrong context and almost placing them. The rider's hand drifted toward his sword. Vaelor stopped 10 feet away. Help you with something? Maybe. The rider's voice carried authority accustomed to being obeyed. We're looking for information about suspicious individuals who might have passed through this area. Foreign agents, dangerous men. A lot of people pass through Cedar Ford, Vaelor said. We're on the trade route between Capital and Northern Territories. You'll have to be more specific. Big guy. Military bearing, sword fighter. Would have been injured. Maybe traveling alone. The rider watched Vaelor carefully. Ring any bells? Nope. But like I said, lots of travelers. They don't usually announce their business. This one would have stood out. The rider stepped closer. The kind of man who commands attention even when trying to hide. Haven't seen anyone like that. Vaelor held the gaze steady. Sorry, I can't help. Tension stretched between them like wire pulled taut. The rider studied Vaelor for another long moment. Then he smiled, expression that held no warmth. Funny thing. You look familiar. We met before? Doubt it. I don't leave Cedar Ford much. Yeah, probably right. The rider turned to his companions. Let's check the next settlement. These folks clearly don't know anything. They mounted their horses with efficient movements, but before riding out, the lead rider looked back at Vaelor. Word of advice, friend. Whoever you're protecting, not worth it. The people hunting him don't stop. They don't negotiate. They just keep coming until the job's done. Anyone standing in the way becomes part of the job. I'll keep that in mind, Vaelor said. The riders left, dust rising behind their horses. Vaelor stood motionless until they disappeared beyond the tree line. Then his legs nearly buckled, adrenaline crash hitting hard. That had been close. Too close. The rider hadn't quite placed him, but recognition had been there. One more second of scrutiny, one different angle of light, and the confrontation would have gone violent. And Vaelor would have killed them, all three, without hesitation, because that's what the Alpha King did when threatened, eliminated threats with maximum efficiency. The realization made him sick. 3 months of trying to become someone different, and his first instinct under pressure was still murder. Liren found him sitting on the well edge, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline come-down. They gone? She asked. For now. Vaelor didn't look at her. They'll be back. Or others will come. Cassian isn't giving up. He's just being methodical. Then we prepare again. No! Vaelor's voice came out flat. I leave. Tonight. Before more people get hurt because of me. Liren sat beside him. We've been through this. That was before armed soldiers started questioning neighbors, before the danger became real instead of theoretical. Vaelor finally met her eyes. I won't let Cedar Ford burn because I'm too selfish to walk away. And I won't let you run because you're too afraid to accept help. Liren's tone sharpened. You think you're protecting us by leaving? You're just protecting yourself from having to trust anyone. That's not fair. It's completely fair. She stood. You've spent 3 months learning to be present, learning to be part of community, learning to let people matter. And the second things get dangerous, you revert to lone wolf bullshit. That's not growth. That's cowardice with noble excuse. The words hit like physical blows. Because she was right. Leaving felt like sacrifice, but it was really self-protection. Easier to run than to stay and risk watching people die for him. Easier to be alone than to bear the weight of others' investment. The Alpha King had been powerful but alone, and here Vaelor was, defaulting to that isolation the moment pressure returned. Maybe he really hadn't changed at all. I don't know how to do this, Vaelor admitted quietly. I don't know how to let people fight for me. Every instinct says handle threats alone, eliminate danger before it spreads, keep others safe by keeping them distant. Then your instincts are wrong, Liren said. Your instincts kept you alive as a king, but they'll kill you as a person. She softened slightly. Look, I'm not saying stay and let everyone die. I'm saying trust that we're capable of making our own choices. Trust that we understand the risks and choose to stand with you anyway. Why would you do that? Because that's what community means. Standing together when standing alone is easier. She held his gaze. And because the man you're becoming is worth standing with, even when he forgets that about himself. Vaelor absorbed that, felt the truth in it fighting against years of learned isolation. All right, he said finally. I stay. We prepare together. But if this goes to hell, It probably will, Lyran interrupted. Most things do. We handle it anyway. She walked back toward her cabin, leaving Vaelor alone with the echoes of his own cowardice. He'd thought leaving was noble sacrifice. Turned out it was just the same control instinct wearing different mask. Still treating others like pieces to protect rather than people capable of choice. Still thinking like the Alpha King who believed his decisions mattered more than everyone else's autonomy. That recognition hurt worse than any wound Cassian had inflicted, because physical wounds healed. But the psychological architecture that made him fundamentally alone, that required demolition, he wasn't sure he could survive. But Lyran was right about one thing. Running now meant proving that 3 months of growth was illusion. That underneath the healing, he remained the same broken king who couldn't trust, couldn't connect, couldn't allow himself to matter to people because mattering meant vulnerability. And vulnerability was the only thing the Alpha King never permitted himself. So Vaelor made a choice that terrified him more than facing armies. He stayed. He trusted. He let himself matter to people who might suffer for that connection. And he prayed that choice didn't kill everyone who'd believed he could change. 2 weeks later, the message arrived. Not soldiers this time, just a merchant traveling through with news from the capital. Empire's falling apart, the merchant told everyone gathered at the settlement center. Queen Regent Cerys and General Cassian can't hold the territories together. Border regions declaring independence. Noble houses refusing orders. Trade routes disrupted by bandits nobody's controlling. It's chaos. What happened? Marcus asked. Turns out ruling an empire is harder than stealing one. The merchant shrugged. They got the throne through betrayal and now nobody trusts them. Soldiers desert. Administrators refuse cooperation. The whole system's collapsing because everyone knows the crown's illegitimate. What about the people? Tessa's father pressed. Common folks getting hurt? Always are when power vacuums open. Merchant took a long drink from offered water. Food shortages. Violence in streets. Refugees fleeing toward frontier because capital's too dangerous. It's bad and getting worse. The merchant moved on, but his words lingered like smoke. Vaelor stood apart from the group, processing information that rewrote everything. His empire, the system he'd built through 20 years of brutal discipline, was dying. Not from external conquest, from internal rot. Because Cassian and Cerys had poisoned the foundations when they murdered legitimate authority. And people were suffering for it. Not nobles, not politicians. Regular people who'd lived safer lives under Vaelor's rule, who'd benefited from stability and order, who'd never asked for regime change. They were starving, fleeing, dying in violence that shouldn't exist, because Vaelor had been too weak to prevent his own assassination, too blind to see betrayal coming, too damaged to maintain the empire after surviving. Guilt crushed down like physical weight. Lyran found him that evening sitting on the ridge above Cedar Ford, staring toward distant mountains that hid the capital beyond. You're thinking about going back, she said. Not question, statement. Vaelor didn't deny it. People are suffering because I failed them. You didn't fail them. Cassian and Cerys failed them. I built a system that collapsed the moment I left. That's failure. He turned to face her. A real leader builds something that survives without them. I built empire dependent on my constant presence. That's not leadership. That's just sustained control. So what are you going to do? Ride back to the capital, announce you're alive, reclaim throne? Lyran's voice carried skepticism. Because that's going to go wonderfully. Cassian will kill you before you reach the palace gates. Maybe. Vaelor's jaw tightened, but doing nothing while people suffer feels like cowardice, and dying pointlessly feels like heroism? She shook her head. You're not thinking straight. You're letting guilt drive decisions instead of strategy. What else should drive them? How about genuine care instead of obligation? Lyran sat beside him. You want to help those people? Fine. Figure out how to actually help instead of just sacrificing yourself to feel better about failure. The words stung because they held truth. Vaelor wanted to return not because he had plan, not because he could genuinely fix anything, but because guilt demanded action even if action was futile. That wasn't heroism. That was ego wearing martyr's mask. So what do I do? He asked. Watch the empire burn from distance? You build something better. Lyran's voice softened. The empire Cassian stole is dying because it was already broken. You said it yourself. System dependent on one person isn't sustainable. So don't go back to restore broken system. Figure out what should replace it. I don't know how. Neither do I. But we figure it out together. She stood. Start by helping refugees who'll start arriving here soon. Give them what Cedar Ford gave you: shelter, work, community that doesn't require submission. Build new model instead of resurrecting dead one. It made sense. Brutal, pragmatic sense. But part of Vaelor, the part that still carried Crown's phantom weight, resisted. Because helping refugees felt small compared to reclaiming empire. Felt like accepting defeat instead of fighting for restoration. And the Alpha King never accepted defeat. Except he wasn't the Alpha King anymore. Was he? That question haunted him more than any nightmare. What? The refugees started arriving 3 days later. First, just families. Farmers displaced by roving bandits, merchants fleeing capital violence, craftspeople whose businesses collapsed in economic chaos. Cedar Ford took them in, found space in existing homes, organized work details, stretched food supplies through communal cooking. More came. Then more. Within 2 weeks, the settlement's population doubled. Strain showed everywhere, food running low, tempers fraying, space becoming premium. The easy cooperation that worked for 50 people fractured under pressure of 100. Vaelor threw himself into organization, coordinating work schedules, mediating disputes, helping construct temporary shelters. The skills that made him effective emperor translated surprisingly well to crisis management. But something felt wrong. Some pattern in the chaos that his instincts flagged but couldn't identify. Then one evening, a refugee arrived who changed everything. She came alone, middle-aged woman dressed in travel-worn clothes, exhaustion carved into every line of her face. But her bearing suggested nobility, and her eyes carried intelligence that tracked everything. Vaelor was helping unload supply wagon when he saw her. Something about her presence triggered recognition, not personal memory, but type recognition. The way she moved, how she assessed surroundings. Palace-trained, court-educated, pretending to be common refugee but failing at the pretense. He approached carefully. "Welcome to Cedar Ford. I'm Vael. We'll find you space and work assignment." She looked at him, really looked, and her eyes widened with recognition that sent ice through his veins. "Your Majesty," she breathed. Vaelor's hand shot out, covering her mouth. His other hand gripped her arm, pulling her away from the crowd. He forced his voice to stay level, conversational. "Let's find you a place to rest. You must be exhausted from traveling." He guided her toward empty barn, aware of eyes tracking their movement but trying to appear natural, helpful resident assisting tired refugee. Once inside with door closed, Vaelor released her and stepped back. "Who are you?" The woman straightened, composing herself. "Lady Marina Kellis. I served on your advisory council before I died." Vaelor cut her off. "Why are you here?" "To find you." Marina's voice shook slightly. "Because everything's falling apart and you're the only one who can fix it." "I'm not fixing anything. I'm dead. Stay dead. That's the plan." "That's cowardice." Marina's tone sharpened. "Your empire is bleeding. Territory is fracturing. People dying. And you're hiding in frontier settlement playing at humble life?" The accusation hit harder because part of him agreed with it. "Cassian will kill me before I reach the capital," Vaelor said. "Going back accomplishes nothing except confirming I'm alive." "Then don't go alone." Marina stepped closer. "There are still loyal houses, generals who never accepted Cassian's authority, common people who remember when Empire actually functioned. You have support waiting. You just need to claim it. By starting civil war, thousands will die." "Thousands are already dying." Marina's composure cracked. "You think Cassian's reign is peaceful? He executes dissidents weekly. Ceres taxes regions into starvation. The empire you built to end warfare has descended into worse violence than before you unified territories." Vaelor wanted to dismiss her words, wanted to believe she was exaggerating or manipulating, but merchant reports confirmed her claims. The empire was collapsing, people were suffering, and he'd let it happen by staying hidden. "I can't go back to being what I was," Vaelor said quietly. "The Alpha King who ruled through fear and dominance, that person destroyed himself. Then be something different." Marina's voice softened. "Be the king who learned humility, who understands community matters more than control, who leads through earned trust instead of imposed authority." She held his gaze. You have chance to build empire that reflects who you've become instead of who you were. The words landed like blade strikes, sharp, precise, cutting through his carefully constructed rationalizations. Because she was right. Staying hidden wasn't growth. It was surrender disguised as healing. Real growth meant returning changed, meant trying to lead differently, even when leading was terrifying, meant risking everything again because the alternative was watching others suffer through his absence. But that risk felt impossible, because Vaelor knew himself, knew how easily he defaulted to old patterns under pressure, knew that power corrupted even good intentions. What if I go back and just become the same tyrant? Then you become the same tyrant, Mirena said. But at least you tried. At least you gave people chance at stable leadership. Staying here guarantees the empire dies. Going back gives it fighting chance. Vaelor looked through the barn door at Cedar Ford, at the community that saved him, at the people who taught him different way of existing, at Lyran, who believed he could change. Leaving felt like betrayal, but staying while empire burned felt like greater betrayal. And that impossible choice, that razor edge between cowardice and sacrifice, was the point of no return he'd been avoiding since he washed up in Lyran's river. I need time to think, Vaelor said. We don't have time. Mirena's urgency intensified. Cassian knows someone's gathering information. He's tightening security, eliminating potential threats. If we're going to move, it has to be soon. 2 days. Vaelor met her eyes. I'll give you answer in 2 days. That might be too late. Then it's too late. But I'm not making this decision in panic. Mirena looked like she wanted to argue. Instead, she nodded. 2 days. But Your Majesty? The empire you built is dying, and only you can save it. She left him alone in the barn, with weight of entire empire pressing down. Vaelor didn't sleep that night. He walked Cedar Ford's perimeter, checking security out of habit, but really just needing movement. His mind churned through impossible calculations. Go back. Risk everything, potentially start civil war, possibly become same tyrant he'd tried to stop being. Stay. Accept empire's collapse. Let people suffer, embrace safety while others bled. Neither option felt right. Both felt necessary, and that contradiction was tearing him apart. Near dawn, he found Lyran in the horse paddock, working with the young stallion. She didn't acknowledge his presence immediately, just kept moving the horse through training exercises with patient repetition. Finally, she spoke. You're leaving. Not statement, certainty. I don't know yet, Vaelor said. Yes, you do. Lyran didn't stop working. You've been leaving since that woman arrived. You're just trying to figure out how to justify it. That's not... Don't. She finally turned to face him. Don't lie to me. Not now. Vaelor met her eyes and saw disappointment there. Not anger. Disappointment was worse. The empire's collapsing, he said. People are suffering. I might be able to help. Might. Possibly. Maybe. Lyran's voice stayed level. Or you might get killed immediately, or start civil war that kills thousands, or reclaim power and become exactly what you were before. But sure, go chase that might. What else am I supposed to do? Stay. Lyran stepped closer. Build something real here instead of trying to resurrect empire built on force. Help these refugees create new community. Lead through example instead of authority. Actually be the change instead of trying to impose change through power. That feels like quitting. That's because you still measure success through scale of control. She shook her head. You've learned so much these months, but you still can't see that small, sustainable community matters more than grand, fragile empire. Small community doesn't feed thousands of refugees. Grand empire apparently doesn't either, given current situation. Lyran's frustration showed through. You're being given choice, Vaelor. Choose violence and power, and maybe restore something broken, or choose peace and community, and definitely build something new. But stop pretending there's noble option here. There's just what you want more. And that was the truth he'd been avoiding. Part of him wanted to return. Wanted the significance of empire, the weight of crown, the validation that came from commanding armies and ruling territories. That part was still the Alpha King, still addicted to power's rush, still measuring self-worth through dominance. But another part, smaller, quieter, harder to hear, wanted to stay. Wanted simple work and honest community. Wanted Lyran and Cedar Ford and the possibility of mattering without controlling. That part was whoever he was becoming, if he let it develop, if he chose growth over glory. The problem was the first part felt natural, comfortable, easy. The second part felt like constant struggle against every instinct he'd spent lifetime building. And when faced with that choice, Vaelor realized something terrible. He didn't trust himself to choose correctly, because if he stayed, guilt would poison everything. He'd resent Cedar Ford for making him abandon Empire, resent Lyran for asking him to be small, resent himself for choosing peace over responsibility. But if he left, he'd probably die trying to reclaim throne. Or worse, he'd succeed and become exactly what he'd fled, powerful, isolated, ruling through force rather than connection. Either path led to loss. Different losses, but losses nonetheless. "I don't know what to do," Vaelor admitted. First honest thing he'd said all night. Lyran's expression softened. "I know. That's what makes this actually hard instead of just dramatic." They stood in pre-dawn darkness while horses moved in their paddock and the settlement slept, unaware that decision made in next hours would reshape everything. Finally, Lyran spoke again. "I can't make this choice for you, but I'll tell you what I see." She held his gaze. "I see a man who's terrified that 3 months of growth wasn't real, that underneath healing, he's still broken king playing at being better person. And rather than keep testing whether change is genuine, he wants to run back to familiar role where he knows exactly who he is, even if that person is terrible." That's exactly it." Lyran cut him off gently. "You're not running toward responsibility. You're running away from uncertainty of actually changing, because change is slow and hard, and you can't control outcome. But power? Power you understand. Power gives you illusion of control even when it destroys you." The words landed like hammer blows, because she was absolutely right. Vaelor wasn't choosing Empire over Cedar Ford because Empire needed him. He was choosing it because pretending to be simple farmer felt like wearing costume that might slip any moment and reveal the tyrant underneath. Going back to being king felt honest in ways staying felt false. And that, more than anything, revealed how completely he'd failed to actually change. 3 months of work, 3 months of trying, 3 months of believing he was becoming someone different. All illusion, all performance, all just the Alpha King playing at humility until real test arrived. And when test arrived, he defaulted to power instantly. The recognition broke something in him, not violently, quietly, like structure cracking under weight it was never built to carry. "I'm not who I thought I was becoming," Vaelor said. His voice came out hollow. "No," Lyran said, "you're exactly who you're becoming. You're just not finished yet." She touched his arm. "Growth isn't linear. You don't heal for 3 months and suddenly become a different person. You make choice to be different every single day. And some days you fail. That's not proof you haven't changed. That's proof change is hard. But I want to go back." Vaelor met her eyes. "I actually want the crown again. What does that say about me? That you're human. That old patterns are comfortable. That significance is addictive." She squeezed his arm. "But wanting something doesn't mean choosing it. You can want the crown and still choose to stay. You can acknowledge the addiction and refuse to feed it." "What if I can't?" "Then you can't." Lyran released him. "And I'll be disappointed, but I'll understand. Because I've seen you fight against who you were every single day for months. If you lose that fight now, it doesn't erase how hard you fought. It means I wasted 3 months. It means you're not done growing. There's a difference." Vaelor wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that returning to Empire wasn't proof of failure, but just temporary setback and longer journey. But he knew himself better than that. Knew that once he stepped back into power, old instincts would take over. Once he commanded armies again, gentle farmer would vanish like morning fog. Once he wore crown again, everything he'd learned in Cedar Ford would become distant memory. Power didn't allow divided loyalty. Either you committed completely or you failed at ruling. And Vaelor knew, deep in the part of himself that stayed brutally honest, that if he went back, he'd commit completely. Cedar Ford would become the fantasy he'd briefly entertained before returning to reality. Lyran would become the woman he almost loved before choosing Empire instead, and he'd become the Alpha King again. Forever this time. That certainty should have made decision easier, should have made him choose to stay, to protect the growth he'd achieved, to preserve the person he was becoming. Instead, It made him realize the terrible truth he'd been avoiding. He wanted to be the Alpha King more than he wanted to be a better person. Power called stronger than peace. Significance mattered more than simplicity. The rush of commanding empires outweighed the quiet satisfaction of chopping wood, and that made him exactly the monster he'd feared he'd always been. The recognition was devastating, because Vaelor had believed, genuinely believed, that 3 months of healing meant something, that he'd fundamentally changed, that given choice between power and peace, he'd choose peace. But faced with actual choice, the old addiction proved stronger than new growth. "I'm sorry," Vaelor said quietly. To Lyran, to Cedar Ford, to himself. "I'm sorry I'm not who you thought I could be." "You're exactly who I thought you could be," Lyran said. Her voice carried sadness, but no surprise. "I just hoped you'd believe it too." She walked away, leaving Vaelor alone with his failure. And in that moment, standing in paddock while dawn broke over settlement that saved him, knowing he was about to abandon everyone who believed in his change, choosing empire over everything he'd learned mattered, Vaelor understood the final truth about himself. He'd been broken long before Cassian's betrayal. The crown hadn't corrupted him. He'd been corrupted from the start. And 3 months of playing at redemption couldn't fix 20 years of fundamental damage. The Alpha King wasn't role he'd outgrown. It was who he actually was. And that realization, more than any betrayal or assassination attempt, was the moment Vaelor truly lost everything. Because you could survive losing empire. But discovering you were irredeemable, that killed something no amount of healing could resurrect. But Vaelor found Lady Marina at dawn. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll return. Gather whoever you can trust. We move in 3 days." Marina's face lit with relief and triumph. "You won't regret this, Your Majesty." But Vaelor already regretted it, already mourned the person he'd almost become before admitting that person was fiction, already felt Cedar Ford slipping away like water through fingers. He spent the next 3 days preparing, not telling people he was leaving, couldn't face that conversation, couldn't handle Lyran's disappointment or Marcus's judgment or Tessa's confusion, just preparing, gathering supplies, planning route, letting the Alpha King resurface fully while the farmer retreated into memory. On the final night, he wrote a letter to Lyran, tried to explain why he was leaving, why he had to go back, why power mattered more than peace, even though that made him a terrible person. Tore it up, wrote another, tore that up too. Finally wrote 3 words. "I'm sorry. Lyran." Left it on her table and slipped away before dawn while settlement slept. Rode out with Lady Marina and 3 guards she'd recruited, headed toward capital, toward empire, toward reclaiming crown that would consume whatever remained of his humanity. And as Cedar Ford disappeared behind him, Vaelor felt the last threads of potential redemption snap. He was going back to save the empire, but there would be no saving himself. That sacrifice should have felt noble, should have felt like choosing duty over desire. Instead, it felt like the final surrender of man too broken to deserve the second chance he'd been given. The Alpha King rode toward his throne, and the man who might have been better died quietly in the darkness behind him. The road to the capital stretched like a scar across landscape Vaelor had once commanded. 5 days of riding hard through territories that barely remembered his name. Villages where his edicts had once held force now flew makeshift banners. Local warlords claiming independence, merchants forming protection guilds, farmers arming themselves against roving bandits that imperial authority no longer controlled. The empire was fracturing in real time. Not dramatic collapse, just slow dissolution as every region decided survival required self-sufficiency rather than distant crown. Vaelor watched it happen with recognition that felt like staring into a mirror. This was his legacy, not the unified territories or enforced peace, but the system so dependent on single authority figure that his removal triggered immediate structural failure. He'd built empire on foundation of himself, and when that foundation cracked, everything came down. Lady Marina rode beside him, pointing out loyalist strongholds and potential allies. Lord Vareth still controls the eastern garrison. Commander Rylan never accepted Cassian's authority. House Morwen maintained significant military resources. She was building coalition, army, force sufficient to challenge Cassian's stolen throne. And Vaelor listened with growing detachment because here's what he understood now. Returning to reclaim empire meant becoming exactly what destroyed it the first time, meant ruling through force and intimidation, meant treating people as resources in his personal restoration project, meant proving that 3 months in Cedar Ford taught him nothing. The recognition should have stopped him, should have made him turn around, return to Lyran, choose the harder path of actual growth over easier path of familiar power. Instead, it hardened something in him, some final acceptance that redemption was fantasy, and he was simply reverting to factory settings. The Alpha King didn't change. He just pretended for a while before inevitability reclaimed him. That acceptance felt almost peaceful, like finally admitting addiction instead of fighting it. On the 6th day, they reached the Thornwood Forest, 20 miles from the capital, deep enough for concealment, close enough for strike operations. The camp was already established, 30 soldiers waiting, maybe 50 total when everyone arrived. Pathetic force compared to Cassian's garrison, but Marina insisted numbers would grow once word spread that Vaelor lived. The soldiers stared when he entered camp, whispers spreading like wildfire. The dead king walks. The Alpha returns. Their faces showed mixture of hope and fear. Hope that legitimate authority might restore order. Fear that civil war would consume what little stability remained. Vaelor understood both reactions. He inspired them because he represented alternative to Cassian's brutality. He terrified them because his methods had never been gentle either. Different tyrant, same tyranny. Commander Rylan approached, grizzled veteran who'd served under Vaelor for 15 years. He dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty, we thought you were dead." "So did I," Vaelor said. "Turns out dying takes more effort than expected." Rylan's weathered face cracked into brief smile. "It's good to have you back, sir. The Empire's gone to hell without you." And that right there was the problem. The Empire couldn't function without him. Hadn't developed institutions or distributed authority or created systems that survived leadership transition. He'd built dictatorship with himself as irreplaceable component, and now he was returning to restore that broken model because the alternative was watching everything burn. Not growth, not change, just choosing familiar evil over unfamiliar chaos. Vaelor moved through camp, greeting soldiers, assessing resources, falling back into command mode with disturbing ease. The peaceful farmer vanished, the strategic king emerged, and the transition felt less like putting on mask and more like removing one. This was who he actually was. Cedar Ford had been the performance. Night fell. Vaelor sat alone near fire, staring at flames while camp settled into watch rotations. Footsteps approached. Marina sat across from him. "You're having doubts." "No," Vaelor said. "I'm having clarity. There's a difference." "About what?" "About whether returning was right choice." Vaelor met her eyes. "It wasn't. But I'm doing it anyway because I'm fundamentally incapable of being anything except what I've always been." Marina studied him. "That's pretty bleak." "That's pretty honest." He poked the fire with stick. "You brought me back thinking I'd changed, thinking I'd learned something, thinking I'd be better version of the Alpha King. But I'm just the same version, and this campaign will prove it." "Then prove me wrong," Marina said quietly. "Lead differently, build differently. Use this chance to create empire that reflects what you learned instead of what you were." Vaelor wanted to laugh, wanted to explain that power didn't allow that kind of nuance. You either dominated completely or failed at ruling. Attempted balance just meant weakness, but Lyran's voice echoed in memory. You measure success through scale of control. Small, sustainable community matters more than grand, fragile empire. Maybe there was third option between total control and complete abandonment. Maybe he could reclaim throne while actually applying Cedar Ford's lessons. Maybe redemption wasn't binary, either complete transformation or total failure, but continuous choice made in small moments. Or maybe that was just rationalization, justification for choosing power while pretending it served higher purpose. Vaelor genuinely didn't know which was true. "I'll try," he said finally. "No promises. But I'll try." "That's all anyone can do," Marina said. She left him with flames and questions that had no comfortable answers. The attack came 3 nights later. Not on their camp. On a supply caravan carrying food to capital refugee centers. Cassian's soldiers intercepted it 20 miles south, confiscated everything, executed the merchants as enemy collaborators. Word reached Vaelor's camp through scouts. Commander Rylan reported with barely contained fury. They killed civilians, merchants just trying to feed people, strung them up as warning. Vaelor absorbed the information with cold calculation. How many soldiers in the unit? 15, maybe 20. Standard patrol strength. We hit them, Vaelor said. Tonight. Make it clear that stolen throne has consequences. The camp mobilized with practiced efficiency, soldiers checking weapons, reviewing approach routes, falling into assault patterns they'd executed dozens of times under Vaelor's command. And Vaelor felt the familiar rush building, the focus, the clarity, the absolute certainty that came from preparing violence. This was where he excelled, not building communities or fostering connections, but identifying threats and eliminating them with maximum efficiency. The Alpha King in his element. They rode out at midnight, 20 soldiers moving through darkness with lethal purpose. Relan navigated, Vaelor commanded, and the machine he'd built years ago activated like it had never stopped. The target was Supply Depot 10 miles south, fortified barn where Cassian's patrol stored confiscated goods. 6 guards outside, maybe 10 inside. Overconfident because they didn't expect resistance. Fatal mistake. Vaelor positioned his soldiers in overlapping fields of fire. Archers on elevated positions. Infantry ready to breach. Escape routes blocked. Then he gave signal. Arrows flew. Guards dropped. Infantry charged. The depot erupted into chaos and screaming. Vaelor moved through carnage with mechanical precision. His blade found throats and hearts with muscle memory refined through decades. No hesitation, no mercy. Just efficient application of violence to achieve tactical objective. Within 5 minutes, every enemy soldier was dead or disabled. Within 10, they'd secured supplies and loaded wagons. Within 15, they were gone, leaving bodies and message, "The Alpha King lives." The ride back felt like descent into something Vaelor had tried to escape. Because during the fight, he'd felt alive in ways Cedar Ford never made him feel. Felt purpose and clarity. Felt like himself instead of pretending to be someone better. And that should have horrified him. Should have been warning sign that he was reverting to worst instincts. Instead, it felt like coming home. Commander Rylan rode beside him with savage satisfaction. "Just like old times, Your Majesty. Clean operation. Perfect execution." "Yeah," Vaelor said, "just like old times." And that was the problem. Because old times had led to palace corridors and betrayal and nearly drowning in the Ashen River. But here he was, repeating same patterns, expecting different results, proving that people fundamentally didn't change no matter how much they wanted to believe otherwise. They reached camp as dawn broke. Soldiers celebrated successful raid. Marina praised strategic brilliance. Everyone treated it as victory. Vaelor felt like he'd lost something important but couldn't articulate what. He found quiet spot away from celebration and sat alone while morning light painted the forest gold. Lyran would be disappointed. Would see tonight's raid as proof he'd chosen violence over growth. Would recognize he'd abandoned everything she tried to teach him. And she'd be right. But here's what Lyran didn't understand about power. It didn't allow half measures. You either committed completely, embraced the violence, accepted the brutality, became the monster, or you failed. Vaelor had tried being gentle king, tried building empire that balanced strength with mercy. And that balanced king got betrayed by his wife and murdered by his best friend. So maybe the lesson wasn't learn to be better. Maybe the lesson was be worse, be harder, be the kind of king that scared people too much to betray. That logic felt sound, pragmatic, brutally honest about how power actually worked. It also felt like excuse, rationalization for choosing easiest path while calling it necessary. Vaelor was too tired to figure out which interpretation was true. He just knew that reclaiming throne required becoming someone Cedar Ford would despise, and he'd made peace with that cost. Or at least he'd told himself he had. Over next 2 weeks, Vaelor's forces grew. Word spread that the legitimate king lived. Loyalist houses sent soldiers. Displaced commanders arrived with intact units. Common people joined because Cassian's regime had become unbearable. By end of second week, Vaelor commanded 200 fighters, still outnumbered by capital garrison, but enough for credible challenge. They conducted raids, disrupted supply lines, ambushed patrols, Each operation designed to bleed Cassian's resources while demonstrating that resistance was possible. And each operation required Vaelor to become more like the king he'd been. More brutal, more calculating, more willing to sacrifice individuals for strategic goals. The transformation was disturbingly easy, like slipping into comfortable clothes after wearing ill-fitting costume. Marina noticed. Your tactics are working. We're gaining support. But you seem different, harder than when we started. War makes everyone harder, Vaelor said. This isn't war yet. This is skirmishing. She studied him. I'm worried about what you'll become when actual war starts. What I've always been. He met her gaze. That's the point, isn't it? Return to being effective ruler. Effectiveness requires brutality. So I become brutal. Simple mathematics. That's not what I wanted. Then you shouldn't have brought me back. Vaelor's voice hardened. You wanted the Alpha King? You're getting him. Complete package. Violence, dominance, willingness to do whatever winning requires. Can't have restoration without the restorer. Marina looked like she wanted to argue. Instead, she nodded slowly and walked away. Because she recognized truth. She'd brought back weapon and now complained it cut things. Vaelor was what he was, and pretending otherwise just wasted everyone's time. That night, scouts reported critical intelligence. Cassian was executing suspected loyalists in the capital. Public displays meant to intimidate resistance. Among the condemned, families of soldiers serving in Vaelor's camp. Wives, children, parents, arrested as traitors by association. Commander Rylan received news about his daughter, 16 years old, scheduled for execution in 3 days. The man who'd served Vaelor for 15 years stood in command tent with tears streaming down weathered face. She's just a girl. Never involved in any of this. He's killing her to hurt me. To hurt you. Vaelor absorbed the information with cold rage building. How many families total? 17. All connected to known resistance fighters. Cassian's making example. Then we make him regret it. Vaelor turned to assembled commanders. We advance the timeline. No more raids. We go for the capital. We end this now. We're not ready, Marina protested. We need more soldiers, more supplies, more... We need to stop Cassian from murdering children. Vaelor's voice cut like blade. Every day we wait, he consolidates power and kills innocents. We move now or we accept being responsible for those deaths. The logic was sound. Also possibly suicidal. They were still outnumbered 3-1. Capital defenses remained formidable. Attacking now meant betting everything on single desperate assault. But doing nothing meant watching children die for their parents' loyalty. And Vaelor had spent 3 months in Cedar Ford learning one lesson he actually believed. Protecting people mattered more than protecting yourself. Even if protecting them required becoming monster. We attack in 2 days, Vaelor said. Maximum force. No holding back. We hit the palace, eliminate Cassian and Cerys. Restore legitimate authority. Any questions? Silence. Then Rylan spoke. We're with you, Your Majesty. To the end. To the end, the other commanders echoed. And Vaelor felt weight of those words pressing down. Because the end might come quickly. Might mean death for everyone who'd chosen to follow him. But the alternative was abandoning principles he'd barely learned to value. So he'd risk everything. Would lead desperate assault against superior force. Would probably die in palace corridors where his crown had been stolen. And if he survived, he'd become exactly the tyrant he'd tried to escape. Either way, the man who'd chopped wood in Cedar Ford and learned about community was dying, being sacrificed on altar of necessity. But maybe that man had always been fiction. Maybe this, leading soldiers to almost certain death, planning violent reclamation of power, was his only authentic self. That thought should have been devastating. Instead, it felt like acceptance. Vaelor was the Alpha King. Always had been. Always would be. Cedar Ford had been a beautiful dream. But dreams ended when reality demanded attention. And reality was coming to capital in 2 days with sword in hand and vengeance in heart. The night before the assault, Vaelor walked camp perimeter alone. 200 soldiers preparing for battle. Sharpening weapons, writing final letters, making peace with possible death. They were doing this because they believed in him, because he represented hope for restored order. They had no idea their hope was misplaced. that he was just another ambitious man claiming legitimacy while serving his own need for significance. But they'd follow him anyway, die for him if necessary, because that's what soldiers did, and that's what leaders accepted when they chose command. Vaelor found himself at edge of camp, staring toward where Cedar Ford lay 40 miles west, too far to see, but he felt its absence like phantom limb. Lyron would be working with horses now. Marcus would be tending sheep. The Brennan brothers hunting in forests. Life continuing without him because life always continued. He'd believed he mattered there. Believed his presence contributed something valuable beyond violence and command. Maybe he had. Briefly. Until crisis demanded response and he'd reverted to type. Or maybe he'd never actually been present, just hiding, using Cedar Ford as refuge while avoiding responsibility. Either way, that chapter was closed. Tomorrow, he'd assault the capital. Either reclaim throne or die trying. No middle ground, no retreat. And if he succeeded, he'd wear crown purchased through blood, would rule empire rebuilt on violence, would prove that power was only language he'd ever truly spoken, that certainty should have felt like failure. Instead, it felt like inevitability. Footsteps approached. Vaelor turned, expecting commander or scout. Instead, he saw Lyron. She stood 20 feet away, travel-worn and exhausted, her storm-gray eyes finding him in darkness. Vaelor's heart stopped. Impossible. She couldn't be here, shouldn't have followed, had no business in war camp on eve of desperate battle. But there she was. Real, present, carrying saddlebag and expression that held disappointment and determination in equal measure. "You left," she said. "Not accusation. Statement." "I left," Vaelor confirmed. "You left a note that said 3 words. She stepped closer. 3 words after 3 months. That's what you thought I deserved. I couldn't face you, couldn't handle your disappointment. So you ran. Lyron's voice stayed level. You talked about choosing differently, about learning from Cedar Ford, about becoming someone beyond the crown. And when test came, you ran back to exactly what you were before. I know. Vaelor met her gaze. You were right about me. I'm not redeemable. I'm just Alpha King playing at being better until reality required actual strength. That's such bullshit. Lyron's composure cracked. You're not playing at anything. You're terrified. Terrified that if you actually changed, you'd lose what makes you feel powerful. So you sabotage growth and call it acceptance. You choose violence and call it necessity. You abandon everyone who believed in you and call it inevitability. What do you want from me? Vaelor's frustration exploded. You want me to watch children die because changing myself is more important? Want me to let empire collapse because building community matters more? I'm trying to do right thing here. No, you're not. Lyron stepped closer. You're trying to do familiar thing. There's a difference. The right thing would be finding third option, building coalition without becoming tyrant, reclaiming authority without losing yourself. But that's hard. That requires constant vigilance. So you default to easy brutality and call it pragmatism. There is no third option. Power requires dominance, or it's not power. Then maybe you don't need power, Lyron's voice rose. Maybe you need purpose instead. Maybe leading 200 people who trust you matters more than ruling empire that fears you. Maybe making different choice tomorrow matters more than reclaiming what you lost. They faced each other in darkness, while camp hummed with pre-battle preparation. And Vaelor felt something crack inside his chest, some final defense crumbling under weight of truth he'd been avoiding. Because Lyron was right. He was choosing familiarity over growth, choosing to be Alpha King, because being anything else required constant terrifying uncertainty. The war, the assault, the dramatic reclamation, it was all theater. Performance designed to avoid actual hard work of transformation. Real change meant staying in Cedar Ford and helping refugees build sustainable community. Meant leading through example instead of authority. Meant accepting that significance came from incremental daily choices rather than grand violent gestures. But that change was slow, undramatic, offered no clear validation that he mattered. So he'd chosen this instead, war and violence and throne. Because even if it destroyed him, at least it felt important. I don't know how to do what you're asking, Vaelor said quietly. Don't know how to be leader without being ruler. Don't know how to matter without dominating. Then learn, Lyron said. She moved close enough that he could see exhaustion in her eyes, could smell horse and road dust on her clothes. Stop expecting to know everything before you try. Stop demanding certainty before you commit. Just make better choice than yesterday, and keep making it until it becomes habit instead of struggle. And if I fail, then you fail. Liren held his gaze, but at least you'll fail trying to grow instead of succeeding at being terrible. Vaelor looked at this woman who'd saved him from River and taught him about presence and followed him 40 miles to deliver truth he desperately needed. And he realized that choosing her, choosing Cedar Ford, choosing growth over glory, wasn't weakness. It was the hardest thing he'd ever do. Harder than building empire. Harder than reclaiming throne. Harder than any battle he'd fought. Because it required admitting that significance came from connection rather than control. That mattering to 50 people genuinely was more valuable than ruling 1,000 people who feared him. That the Alpha King was cage, not crown. And freedom meant walking away from power even when power felt like oxygen. The recognition should have been liberating. Instead, it was agonizing. Because 200 soldiers waited in camp, trusted him, needed him to lead assault that might save their families. And choosing to abandon them now meant betraying that trust as completely as Cassian had betrayed him. So Vaelor faced impossible choice: betray soldiers who needed him, or betray the person he was trying to become. Lead the war or choose the growth. Command or connect. Crown or conscience. And standing in darkness with Liren watching and army waiting and dawn approaching, Vaelor understood this was the actual point of no return. Not leaving Cedar Ford. That had been easy default. This, choosing to walk away from power when power served clear purpose, choosing peace when violence was justified, choosing growth when growth meant abandoning responsibility. This was the real test. And he had until sunrise to decide whether passing it was possible, or whether some men were simply too broken to choose differently, even when different was right. Vaelor stood in darkness between Liren and the war camp, between redemption and ruin, between the man he'd been and whoever he might become. Dawn was 3 hours away. 3 hours to make choice that would define everything that followed. He looked at Liren, exhausted from 40 miles of hard riding, standing in military camp she had no business entering, offering him salvation he didn't deserve. Then he looked back at the camp. 200 soldiers preparing for assault. Commander Ryland's daughter scheduled for execution in 2 days. Families depending on his leadership. Empire bleeding without legitimate authority. Real people. Real stakes. Real consequences for choosing wrong. I can't abandon them, Vaelor said quietly. Those soldiers trust me. Those families need me. Walking away now makes me exactly what Cassian is. Someone who puts personal comfort over responsibility. Liren's expression didn't change. So you're choosing the assault? I don't know. Vaelor's voice cracked. I genuinely don't know. Everything you said is true, but everything I said is also true. How do I choose between growth and duty? Between becoming a better person and doing right thing? Maybe they're not opposite. Liren stepped closer. Maybe right thing is becoming a better person. Maybe duty means breaking cycles instead of perpetuating them. People will die if I don't lead that assault. People will die if you do lead it. Different people. Same death. She held his gaze. You can't save everyone, Vaelor. You can only choose which version of yourself you want to be. The one who perpetuates violence or the one who builds alternatives. And if there is no alternative, if violence is only language power understands, then you've learned nothing. Liren's voice hardened. You've spent 3 months pretending growth while actually just waiting for excuse to return to comfortable brutality. And tomorrow, you get your excuse. You lead assault, lots of people die, you reclaim thrones soaked in blood, and you tell yourself it was necessary. That you had no choice. That duty required it. She paused, letting words sink in. But here's truth you're avoiding. You always have choice. You're just terrified of choosing differently because different is hard and uncertain and doesn't validate that the last 20 years meant something. The words landed like hammer blows because they were absolutely accurate. Vaelor was terrified. Not of battle, not of death, but of admitting that building empire had been fundamentally wrong approach. That power through domination was addiction, not necessity. that everything he'd accomplished was monument to his own ego rather than genuine service. Admitting that meant confronting 20 years of choices that hurt people, meant accepting he'd been villain of his own story, meant recognizing the crown had never been achievement, just beautiful cage he'd built for himself. And that recognition would break him more completely than Cassian's betrayal ever had. So he'd been avoiding it, hiding behind duty and necessity and tactical justification, using the assault as excuse to delay actual reckoning with who he'd been and what that cost. Liren saw through it, saw through him, offered no comfort, no easy answers, just brutal honesty that he either accepted or rejected. "What do I do?" Vaelor asked. Not rhetorical question, genuine plea for guidance from someone whose judgment he trusted more than his own. Liren considered, then spoke with careful precision. "You go into that camp. You tell those soldiers the truth, that you're not leading assault because assault perpetuates everything that's broken about how power works in this empire, that you're not abandoning them but offering different path, that instead of reclaiming throne through violence, you're building alternative. Community that protects people without requiring submission. Network that challenges Cassian's authority through sustained resistance rather than single desperate battle." She paused. "Some will follow you, some won't. Some will call you coward. Let them. Because real courage isn't charging into battle you know is wrong. Real courage is admitting you're wrong and choosing differently even when everyone expects you to choose violence." Vaelor absorbed that, felt the weight of it settling into his bones. Everything she said made sense, was right, was the actual hard choice instead of comfortable default, and would probably get people killed, would definitely disappoint soldiers who'd risked everything believing he'd lead them to victory, would absolutely make him look weak and indecisive and everything an Alpha King was supposed to transcend. But maybe that was the point. Maybe Alpha King was role that needed to die. Maybe real strength meant building something that didn't require one person's dominance to survive. The recognition didn't come as dramatic revelation, just slow, grinding acceptance of truth he'd been circling for months. He couldn't save the Empire by reclaiming the throne, because the throne itself was the problem. "All right," Vaelor said finally, "I'll try it your way." "Not my way," Liren corrected. "Your way. The version of you that's been trying to emerge for 3 months. I'm just reminding you he exists." "Yeah." Vaelor managed small smile. "Thanks for that. Don't thank me yet. This is about to get really hard." She was absolutely right about that. Vaelor called assembly at first light. 200 soldiers gathered in clearing, expectant faces turned toward their returned king. They anticipated orders for assault, battle plans, inspiring speech about reclaiming what was stolen. Instead, Vaelor stood before them with Liren at his side and said words that felt like stepping off cliff. "I'm not leading the assault." Silence. Shocked, absolute silence. Then voices erupted. Confusion, anger, betrayal. Commander Rylan pushed forward. "Your Majesty, we don't understand. My daughter—" "I know," Vaelor said. His voice carried over the chaos. "I know what's at stake. I know families are in danger. I know you came here believing I'd save them through force, but I can't do that. Won't do that. Because that approach is exactly what destroyed this empire in the first place." The crowd's anger intensified. Soldiers who'd risked everything staring at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to fury. Vaelor pressed on. 20 years ago, I unified these territories through violence, forced warring factions into submission, built empire where my word was absolute authority, and I told myself it was necessary, that peace required domination, that strength meant control. He paused, meeting eyes throughout the crowd. But here's what I learned these past months. That empire was always fragile, always dependent on my presence, always one betrayal away from collapse, because I never built institutions or distributed authority or created system that valued people over power. I built dictatorship, and when dictator falls, dictatorship falls with him. "You're abandoning us," someone shouted, "just like you abandoned the empire." "No," Vaelor said. "I'm offering something different. Instead of reclaiming throne through assault that kills hundreds and restores same broken system, we build alternative. Network of communities that resist Cassian's authority through sustained non-cooperation. economic coalition that undermines his resources, distributed leadership that can't be eliminated by killing one person. That's cowards talk, another voice called. We need a king. You need a scapegoat, Vaelor shot back. Someone to carry all responsibilities so you don't have to. Someone to make hard choices so you can blame them when choices turn bad. That's what kings are. Convenient receptacles for collective failure. His voice hardened. I'm not your king anymore. I'm just a person who made terrible mistakes and barely survived consequences. And I'm telling you that repeating those mistakes won't save anyone. It'll just add more bodies to pile. The crowd wrestled with his words. Some nodded slowly. Others looked betrayed. Most seemed confused. Commander Ryland spoke, his voice rough with emotion. My daughter dies in 2 days. You're telling me to just accept that? I'm telling you that getting yourself killed in failed assault doesn't save her. Vaelor held the man's gaze. But coordinated rescue operation might. Small team, surgical strike, extract prisoners without triggering full battle. That's tactical thinking instead of emotional reaction. Ryland's expression shifted. Considering, calculating. I can help plan that operation, Vaelor continued. Can provide intelligence about palace layout, guard rotations, everything I know. But I'm not leading army to reclaim throne. That path leads to same destination we're trying to escape. What about justice? Lady Marina stepped forward. Cassian murdered you. Cerys betrayed everything. They deserve punishment. They deserve accountability, Vaelor corrected. Not punishment. There's a difference. Punishment is about revenge. Accountability is about consequences and preventing repetition. We hold them accountable by making their authority irrelevant, by building systems that don't require their permission to function. This is naive, Marina said flatly. Power doesn't surrender willingly. You taught me that. I taught wrong, Vaelor said. Power doesn't surrender, but it becomes irrelevant when people stop granting it legitimacy. Cassian rules because people obey. We stop obeying, not through dramatic rebellion, but through sustained refusal. His power evaporates. The crowd murmured, arguments breaking out. Some soldiers nodding agreement, others shaking heads in disgust. Vaelor let the chaos build. Let them wrestle with concepts that contradicted everything military culture taught. Let the cognitive dissonance do its work. Finally, old veteran from back of crowd spoke. His voice carried weight of decades in service. I served under you for 18 years, he said. Watched you build this empire. Believed in what we accomplished. But I also watched you become something that scared me. Something that forgot individuals while obsessing over territories. He stepped forward so Vaelor could see his face. Scarred, weathered, carrying weight of too many wars. If you're saying there's a different way, I'll listen. Because what we've been doing, it grinds people to dust, and I'm tired of being ground. Others murmured agreement. Not majority, but significant minority. Vaelor felt something shift. Not victory, but possibility. Here's what I'm offering, he said. Anyone who wants to attempt assault, go. I won't stop you. You're free people making free choice. But I'm not leading it. I'm returning to Cedar Ford. Building coalition of frontier settlements that operate outside imperial authority. Creating economic network that makes capital's control irrelevant. Establishing system where power comes from cooperation rather than domination. He paused. It's slow work. Unglamorous. Won't make legends or restore empire. But it might actually change how power functions instead of just changing who holds it. The crowd stood silent, processing, calculating personal cost versus potential benefit. Then Commander Ryland spoke. I'll join the rescue operation for my daughter. If that succeeds, I'll consider your coalition. But I need my family safe first. Fair, Vaelor said. I'll help plan that mission. Others began speaking, some volunteering for rescue, some still committed to assault, some wanting to hear more about alternative before deciding. The unified force fractured into smaller groups with different priorities, exactly what military command feared, exactly what distributed authority required. Lady Marina watched with expression mixing disappointment and grudging respect. You're destroying everything we built here, she said quietly. I'm transforming it, Vaelor corrected. Destroying would be leading you into battle that gets everyone killed while accomplishing nothing. This way, some achieve their goals without requiring everyone's sacrifice for single dramatic gesture. You've changed. I'm trying to. He met her eyes. Whether I succeed is question I'll be asking myself for rest of my life. Morena nodded slowly, then turned to address portion of crowd. Anyone still committed to assault, we plan without Vaelor. We're not stopping just because he lost his nerve. About 40 soldiers moved toward her, enough for credible force, enough to probably get most of them killed. Vaelor felt guilt spike. Wanted to stop them. Wanted to argue more. Wanted to command them to stand down. Instead, he let them go. Because that's what distributed authority meant. People making own choices. Even wrong ones. Lyran touched his arm. You did right thing. Doesn't feel right, Vaelor said. Feels like abandoning people who need leadership. They need freedom more than leadership. She squeezed his arm. You gave them that. Around them, camp dissolved into smaller groups planning different operations. Rescue team, assault force, group returning to Cedar Ford to help build coalition. Unity fragmenting into diversity. Single strong voice becoming chorus of weaker ones. It felt like failure, felt like loss of control, felt like everything military training said to prevent. It also felt like first genuinely right choice Vaelor had made in 20 years. And that recognition carried weight nothing else had. Because choosing to not lead, choosing to enable rather than command, to distribute rather than concentrate, to build rather than conquer, that required strength the Alpha King never possessed, required admitting he didn't have all answers, required trusting others, required accepting that significance came from enabling collective action rather than individual dominance, required becoming someone fundamentally different than who he'd been. Vaelor looked at rising sun painting forest gold and felt something close to peace. Not accomplishment, not victory, just acceptance that growth was possible even for people who'd spent lifetime being terrible. And that acceptance, fragile as morning mist, was more valuable than any crown. The rescue operation launched 3 nights later. Vaelor planned it, but didn't lead it. Provided intelligence about palace layout, guard patterns, prisoner holding areas. Taught team about timing and coordination and backup plans. Then watched them execute it without him. 15 soldiers. Commander Rylan at Lid. Moving through capital darkness toward palace dungeons where families waited for execution. Vaelor and Lyran monitored from forest camp 2 miles outside capital walls, close enough to receive updates, far enough to not interfere. Waiting was agony. Every minute stretched infinite while Vaelor imagined everything going wrong. Guards discovering infiltration, alarms sounding, team getting trapped in palace corridors where he'd nearly died months ago. But he didn't intervene. Didn't take command, didn't override their decisions with his supposedly superior judgment, just waited and trusted, and discovered that trust was harder than any battle he'd fought. Near midnight, signal came. Success. Prisoners extracted. Team withdrawing. Vaelor felt tension drain from muscles he hadn't realized were locked. They'd done it. Without his leadership, without his direct control, without needing the Alpha King to make it work. The team returned near dawn, exhausted but intact. 17 rescued prisoners, including Rylan's daughter, terrified but alive. Rylan found Vaelor immediately. His weathered face showed complex emotion, relief, gratitude, something close to understanding. Your intelligence was perfect, he said. Everything you told us was accurate. We couldn't have done it without your knowledge. But you did do it without my command, Vaelor pointed out. Led the operation yourself. Made decisions in moment. Succeeded through your capability, not my control. Rylan absorbed that, nodded slowly. Yeah, we did. That's the point, Vaelor said. You're competent leader. Always were. You just needed space to prove it instead of having someone hovering over every decision. Feels strange, uncomfortable. Growth usually does. Vaelor managed small smile. Trust me, I'm learning that the hard way. Around them, rescued prisoners reunited with families. Tears and embraces and expressions of overwhelming relief. Real people saved through coordinated effort rather than dramatic individual heroism. This was what distributed authority looked like. Slower, messier, less glamorous than single warrior conquering obstacles. Also more sustainable, more replicable, more likely to survive setback. Lady Marina's assault force had launched simultaneously with rescue operation. 40 soldiers attacking palace directly to reclaim throne through force. Reports came back by morning. Disaster. Cassian's forces, forewarned somehow, had been waiting. Ambush and palace approach. 20 soldiers dead. Rest scattered. Marina herself wounded but escaped. The dramatic assault, the kind of bold strike Alpha King would have led, had failed catastrophically, achieved nothing except confirming Cassian's authority and eliminating resistance fighters. Meanwhile, quiet rescue operations succeeded completely. The contrast wasn't lost on survivors. Soldiers who'd dismissed Vaelor's approach as cowardice reconsidered. Some approached asking about coalition. Some wanted to join Cedar Ford Network. Some remained skeptical but less certain of their skepticism. Vaelor watched the shift happen, watched people recalibrate understanding of what strength meant, watched military culture's assumptions about power get challenged by practical results. It wasn't victory. Cassian still held capital, empire still collapsed, suffering still continued, but paradigm was shifting, alternative was emerging, different way of organizing resistance becoming visible, and that visibility mattered more than any throne. Intet. Over following weeks, Vaelor worked to build coalition. Not empire, not unified authority, but network of settlements coordinating resources and resistance, each community maintaining autonomy while cooperating on shared challenges. Cedar Ford became hub. Other frontier settlements joined. Refugees found shelter and distributed system instead of overwhelming single location. Trade routes reorganized around mutual benefit rather than imperial control. It was slow, frustrating, constantly threatened by Cassian's remaining authority. But it worked. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to prove concept was viable. Vaelor's role evolved, not commander, not king, something more like coordinator, person who facilitated connections between communities without dictating terms, who provided knowledge without requiring obedience, who enabled cooperation without demanding control. It felt wrong constantly. Every instinct screamed to take charge, impose order, force efficiency through dominance. Vaelor fought those instincts daily, sometimes won, sometimes lost. Constantly apologized when he reverted to commanding instead of suggesting. Lyran stayed close throughout, not as subordinate or even partner in traditional sense, more like conscience, mirror reflecting when he slipped into old patterns, reminder that growth was continuous choice, not destination. One evening, 2 months after returning to Cedar Ford, Vaelor found her in the paddock working with horses. "I'm not good at this," he said without preamble. "This whole distributed authority thing. I keep wanting to take control, keep assuming I know better, keep treating facilitation like weakness." "I know," Lyran said. "Everyone knows. You're about as subtle as rock slide. So why do people keep working with me? Because you're trying." She didn't stop working. Because you catch yourself. Because you apologize when you screw up instead of justifying. Because you're actually attempting to change instead of just performing change. Doesn't feel like enough. It rarely does. Real growth is mostly feeling inadequate while slowly becoming less terrible. She glanced at him. "You expecting transformation to feel triumphant? Kind of hoping for that, yeah. Life doesn't work that way." Lyran returned to the horse. "You just keep choosing better until choosing better becomes habit. Then one day you realize you've been making right choice for weeks without thinking about it. That's success. Anticlimactic but real." Vaelor absorbed that, found strange comfort in the idea that success was subtle accumulation rather than dramatic moment. The old him would have hated that, would have needed grand gesture, clear victory, unambiguous validation. But the person he was becoming could live with subtle, could find meaning in incremental, could accept that mattering to small community was more valuable than commanding vast empire. That acceptance felt like freedom in ways Crown never had. 6 months after leaving the capital, word came that Cassian's regime was collapsing, not through military defeat, through economic strangulation. The coalition network had diverted enough trade that capital couldn't sustain itself. Territories declared independence not through rebellion, but through simple non-participation. Cassian tried to enforce authority through violence, sent soldiers to rebellious regions. But soldiers deserted because they weren't being paid. Mercenaries refused employment because gold was worthless when nobody would accept it. The empire didn't fall dramatically. It just dissolved, became irrelevant. People stopped acknowledging its authority and built alternatives. Everything Vaelor described was happening. System collapsed through sustained resistance rather than dramatic overthrow. News arrived that Cassian had fled capital. Cerys had surrendered to regional governors and been exiled. The palace stood empty, the throne unclaimed. Victory, apparently. Except it didn't feel like victory. Just like situation resolving through inevitable process. Power draining away when foundation of consent withdrew. Vaelor received messenger from capital governor requesting his presence. They wanted him to return. Reclaim throne. Restore legitimate authority now that usurpers were gone. The temptation was enormous. Everything he'd wanted. Crown returned. Empire available for reclaiming. Validation that he'd been right all along. He could go back, could step into that familiar role, could tell himself this time would be different because he'd learned humility. But he'd also learned that power didn't allow humility. That throne demanded certain behaviors. That playing king, even trying to play it better, still meant playing role that ultimately corrupted. Vaelor stood in Cedar Ford Settlement Center, holding Messenger's letter, while community he'd helped build watched and waited. Lyran stood nearby, not speaking, just present, letting him make choice without pressure. And Vaelor realized that 6 months ago this would have been easy choice. He would have returned immediately, reclaimed crown without question. But 6 months of actual work had changed the calculation. He'd seen what distributed authority could build. Had experienced significance that came from enabling rather than commanding. Had felt freedom that came from not carrying empire's weight alone. The throne still called, still promised meaning and purpose and validation. But Cedar Ford offered something more valuable, genuine connection, real community, actual presence instead of performed authority. And forced to choose between them, Vaelor discovered which one actually mattered. He looked at Messenger. Tell the governors thank you, but no. The Empire doesn't need king. It needs people willing to build something better than Empire. I'm staying here to help with that. The messenger looked shocked. But Your Majesty, you're legitimate heir. The throne belongs to nobody, Vaelor interrupted. That's the point. Concentrate power in single person, and you create situation where betrayal or death causes total collapse. Better to build system where authority comes from sustained cooperation, where leadership is distributed function rather than individual possession. He paused. Tell them to establish council, representatives from each territory, decisions made through consensus, authority earned through service rather than inherited through bloodline. It'll be messy and slow and frustrating, but it'll survive transition between leaders, and that's worth more than any crown. The messenger departed, still confused. Vaelor turned to find Cedar Ford residents watching with expressions ranging from respect to relief to something close to pride. Lyran approached. That was the right choice. Felt like it, Vaelor said. Still feels strange. Turning down power I spent 20 years building toward. That's how you know it was right. She smiled slightly. Wrong choices feel comfortable. Right ones feel like dying. Cheerful perspective. I'm full of cheerful perspectives. Lyran touched his arm. You did good. Actually good. Not just performed it. Thanks. Vaelor looked around Cedar Ford, at community that saved him, taught him, gave him space to become someone different. I think I'm going to stay here, keep building this coalition, keep learning how to be person instead of symbol. Good plan. Lyran held his gaze, and maybe someday you'll stop measuring your worth through significance and just accept that being present is enough. That going to happen anytime soon? Probably not. But that's okay. Growth is process, not destination. Vaelor smiled, found genuine peace in that acceptance. The Alpha King was dead. Truly dead this time. Not murdered, not betrayed, just voluntarily surrendered in favor of something more valuable. And standing in Cedar Ford while sunset painted mountains gold, Vaelor understood the final truth about power and redemption. Real strength wasn't dominating others. It was mastering yourself. Real victory wasn't claiming throne, it was choosing not to. Real significance wasn't commanding empire, it was contributing to community. And real redemption wasn't dramatic gesture or perfect transformation. It was daily choice to be slightly better than yesterday, repeated until better became default instead of exception. The Empire would rebuild. Without him. Maybe better without him. Life would continue, smaller, quieter, less dramatic, but infinitely more honest. And honestly, lived life, present, connected, contributing without controlling, was worth more than any crown could ever be. Vaelor had lost everything, and in losing it, found everything that actually mattered. Years passed. The territories reorganized into loose federation, council governance, distributed authority. Messy, frustrating, constantly arguing. Also stable, adaptable, resilient to individual failures. Cedar Ford thrived as coalition hub, became model for other settlements, proved that cooperation could replace dominance. Vaelor remained, not as leader, as participant, sometimes coordinator, sometimes mediator, sometimes just laborer working horses and mending fences. He and Lyran built partnership that resembled marriage without requiring official recognition, comfortable presence, mutual support, love earned through consistency rather than declared through ceremony. He never stopped struggling with old instincts, never stopped wanting to control situations or impose solutions, never achieved perfect transformation. But he kept choosing differently, kept catching himself, kept apologizing and adjusting, kept growing through uncomfortable incremental progress. Some people criticized him, called him coward who abandoned throne, blamed him for empire's collapse, accused him of taking easy path. Vaelor absorbed criticism without defending himself, because defending meant arguing about significance, and he'd learned that proving significance was trap that fed ego instead of serving purpose. Other people praised him, called him revolutionary who changed power dynamics, credited him with building alternative to dictatorship, celebrated his transformation. Vaelor absorbed praise without believing it, because believing meant thinking he'd arrived somewhere final. And he'd learned that growth never stopped requiring effort. Most people just knew him as Vael, the guy who worked Lyran's horses, who mediated disputes when asked, who chopped wood and told stories and contributed without needing recognition. That anonymity felt like freedom the crown never allowed. On quiet evening 10 years after choosing Cedar Ford over capital, Vaelor sat on ridge above settlement watching stars emerge while darkness deepened. Lyran found him there, as she often did, sat beside him without needing to speak. They existed in comfortable silence while night deepened and settlement lights flickered below. Finally, Vaelor spoke. "You ever regret it? Choosing me? Choosing this life instead of something grander?" "Every day," Lyran said, then ruined seriousness with smile. "But I regret most choices. That's how you know they matter." Vaelor laughed, appreciated her refusal to make anything feel final or certain or completely resolved. Because that's how life actually worked, not through dramatic resolutions and perfect transformations, but through continuous choice, daily recommitment, sustained effort that never quite felt sufficient but somehow accumulated into meaningful change. The empire Vaelor built through force had collapsed, but the community he helped build through cooperation survived, thrived, expanded, proved that another way was possible, not perfect way, not easy way, but sustainable way, replicable way that valued people over power and connection over control. And standing on ridge above Cedar Ford while stars wheeled overhead and Lyran sat quietly beside him, Vaelor understood the ultimate truth about crowns and redemption. Some men were born to rule. Some men learn to lead. But the rarest men learn to serve. And service, genuine, humble, consistent service to community without requiring recognition or control, was the only crown worth wearing. The Alpha King had died in River months ago. But the man who emerged from that death, scarred and humble and perpetually uncertain, had built something the king never could, a life that mattered without dominating, a legacy that served without commanding, a significance that came from presence instead of power. And in the end, that was the only empire worth building, the kind that existed in connections rather than conquests, in choices rather than commands, in the quiet daily work of being better today than yesterday. Vaelor had lost his throne and gained his humanity. The trade, he'd finally learned, was worth it. Every single day, it was worth it. The end. Epilogue. 20 years after Vaelor chose Cedar Ford over capital, historians would debate his legacy. Some called him the fallen king who abandoned duty. Others called him revolutionary who transformed power. Most called him complex figure who defied simple categorization. But in Cedar Ford and throughout the coalition network he helped establish, people remembered him differently. They remembered the man who chopped wood, who mediated disputes patiently, who listened more than he spoke, who contributed without needing credit, who made mistakes and apologized, who grew old working with horses and building community rather than commanding armies and conquering territories. They remembered someone who proved that significance came from how you treated the person in front of you, not how many people feared your name. And when Vaelor finally died, peacefully, surrounded by community he'd served for decades, they buried him not in royal tomb or grand monument, but in simple grave beside Cedar Ford settlement. The headstone carried no titles, no royal lineage, no imperial achievements, just name and dates and single-line Lyran insisted upon. He learned to choose differently. And for a man who'd spent life seeking significance through power, that simple acknowledgement of growth was the only legacy that mattered. The Alpha King was legend, but Vael the farmer, Vael the neighbor, Vael the person who stayed present and kept choosing better, that man was real. And real in the end was worth infinitely more than legend.